Hello, everybody. Welcome to the final Sunday of IGT Sunday Conversation. So we're going to have a lot of fun tonight. I'm really excited. We are going to be talking about all things tutors. Before we get too deep into that, I just want to say, as I mentioned, this is the last weekend for this series. We have had 10 awesome shows so far. If you guys have been here for all of them, then thank you so much. If this is your first time, then you better go back on YouTube and check some of these out because we've had some really good conversations over the last 10 weeks. And we've talked to some really important people in the trade, some experts, um, lots of fun stories, everything really. And it's a great way to pass time, if you're driving or whatever you're doing, that you can listen to things in the background. I've been listening, not to these ones, of course, but to a lot of other people's webinars in the background while I'm cutting or doing other stuff. And yeah, I love these webinars. It's such a great way to absorb information while we're, I don't know, doing other stuff. Maybe you're doing other stuff right now, who knows? But thank you guys for being here. And yeah, let's get started. Lauryn, if you are there, we can kick it off. Welcome.
Justin.
Hi.
Hey.
How are you doing tonight?
Well, it's the morning for me, and I'm doing great.
The morning.
Yeah.
You're on the
I'm
opposite
over in
side of the world.
Philly. Exactly. It's pretty incredible that we can do this.
Yeah, it is pretty wild to think, it's nighttime for me, it's morning for you, and on the internet,
the afternoon for some people. Yeah,
it's
a different time of day for everyone. So,
yeah,
hello.
But on the internet,
it's
like it's just now.
Right. Yeah.
All time is the same. So, okay, Lauryn, we've talked before on your podcast, Gemology Worldwide. This is your first time coming on my side of the world. So let's get a little bit of introduction. Who are you? And why are we talking about tutors today?
Oh, well, my name is Lauryn Volovar, and I'm in the jewelry industry. I'm a gemologist and a jewelry designer for the company Earth's Treasury. We focus on Montana sapphires mostly, and I'm just a self-proclaimed tutor-phile. I'm not a historian, and these interests have just kind of combined, because I work in the jewelry industry and the Tudor period has a ton of amazing jewelry. So this kind of just goes hand in hand for me. And yeah, I've been obsessed with the Tudors for a really long time now. And it's kind of made me a history nerd in general. And I think podcasts have really helped that actually, because, you learn about history in school and it's just never seemed interesting to me. And then later on, I don't know why, I just started reading all these stories and I was wondering how I could have missed this. And it's just sent me down this road of, learning all the history I can.
Totally. Well, thanks for joining us. And so for everybody else who's watching, basically the way that we came to this point today where we're here with you guys was totally, I guess, on accident. It was like a random Facebook comment about the TV show The Tudors, and you commented on it and said, "Oh man, I'm a huge Tudor fan too." And then that got me thinking like, oh man, I wanted to do a talk like this, but I wasn't really ready or willing to do all of the homework that was going to be required to do this. And I knew that Lauryn has a background in jewelry and design. I have a background in gem cutting, and we both love the Tudors. So I was like, okay, I think together we could do it. And I think we're about to do it.
And we can. Yeah.
I saw what the PowerPoint looks like, and it looks pretty cool. So
yeah.
Is there anything else we need to say? As you said, and I'll say it again, we are not historians. We are just having fun here. So if you guys ask questions, that's cool, but we might not be able to answer all of them. And if you guys start asking questions that are going outside of the realm of the jewelry trade, we might not know what you're talking about. So
yeah, and a lot of my opinions and assumptions will come out here. Like Justin said, this is going to be fun. So we might be theorizing about things a little bit when it comes to the personalities of the people we'll be talking about. So we're hoping it's got a little bit more personality than just a typical history virtual, webinar.
I hope so. If it doesn't, then I think we might have failed
Yeah.
in our journey here. Okay, so let's kick it off. So Lauryn, we'll start with you. Can you, just so we can have an idea about where we are in the world and in time, what was going on? I guess first, before we even say this question, I want to give some time scope here, because we've shortened the Tudor period slightly just to make our job a little easier. So tonight's talk, we're going to be pretty much focusing on 1509 to 1603. So this is Henry VIII's rise to power until the death of Elizabeth. So that's kind of where we're looking at tonight. So for those dates, Lauryn, what was going on in the Tudor period?
Yeah, well, I'll pull up my slideshow here and we'll get started. All right, so basically the two major things that were going on in Europe during the Tudor period were the Renaissance, which was a cultural and artistic European movement that spanned from the late 14th century to the early 17th century. And because it was so artistic, it directly affected jewelry and how jewelry was made and designed. The other major thing that was going on was the Protestant Reformation, which was a religious movement led by Martin Luther, and it formed the basis of Protestantism. And because religion was a part of everyone's life, literally every single person, it was all day, every day, religion was around you. That was huge that this revolution was going on, because you'll see later on about half the people that we'll talk about are Catholic and half the people that we'll talk about are Protestant, and that affects the way they want to portray themselves and the way they rule. So the Tudors themselves were a Welsh English family who ruled England from 1485 to 1603. But as Justin said, we're going to be mostly focusing on Henry and Elizabeth. So the reason that England kind of started off late in the Renaissance was because the War of the Roses was going on. And that was like a 30-year dramatic saga of a war between the Lancastrians and the Yorks. And because that was going on, there was no real artistic or enlightened movement happening in England like the rest of Europe. So it wasn't until Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, came to the throne and the war ended that we could really get into the Tudor period and the Renaissance that was happening in England. So, and like I said, Henry and Elizabeth are the two biggest jewelry lovers, as well as being the most popular rulers of the Tudor time. So we're going to be focusing on them for the presentation.
And do you think we could even make the general assumption that maybe between Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, these are probably some of the most well-known and maybe even the most popular rulers of all time in England? Do you think?
Yes. Whether they are the most well-loved or they're definitely the most well-known. I would say Elizabeth I is pretty overwhelmingly loved and respected by everyone. Henry VIII, while he's super well-known because of all his drama, I don't know if he's the most well-liked all the time, because he wasn't really the best ruler, even if he was.
He was a drama king, literally.
Yes, yeah. So we can get started with him. He was born in 1509, or I'm sorry, he became king in 1509 after the death of his father, Henry VII, but he was second in line to the throne. 7 years earlier, his brother Edward died shortly after marrying the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon. He was handsome, athletic, intelligent, willful, and basically everyone was expecting Henry VIII to be this awesome ruler. And when he took the throne, he kind of was. He was a popular king. He threw parties. He went on these like really exciting military exploits that were mostly for show and to make him feel good, but it made everyone really excited, like England was doing something. And later on, after a lot of debt and a lot of drama and not a lot happening for the people, he was kind of seen as an egotistical and secure tyrant, which is a pretty accurate description if you ask me. So, because of the Tudor family's weak claim to the throne, he really needed a male heir, and that kind of guided his entire legacy. So, you can't talk about Henry without talking about his 6 wives, and the easiest way to remember them all is divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And each story just gets sadder than the last. So I'll just go through them really quickly because it's insane. It's like a soap opera. So Catherine of Aragon was his brother's widow, and he decided to marry her when he came to the throne because it kept this alliance between England and Spain, which was really crucial for England at the time because they were this new dynasty that needed power and alliances. After 20 something years of marriage, she gave birth to one daughter after several miscarriages and stillborns. And Henry's eyes started to wander and finally settled on Anne Boleyn. And he basically flirted with her for 7 years and tried to get a divorce granted to him by the Pope. And the Pope said, you can't just get a divorce because your wife isn't giving you a son. So then he tried to say that because he had married his brother's widow, that the marriage was never valid in the first place, and that didn't fly with the Pope either. So finally, Henry just decided to break from the Catholic Church entirely and make himself the emissary to God, which kind of squared with his whole personality anyway. I think the whole time he was kind of wondering why he even had to answer to anyone but God, since, he's this wonderful king. And and that was called the King's Great Matter, and it started the Church of England. So he goes through all this, marries Anne Boleyn. She gives birth to a beautiful baby girl, the Princess Elizabeth, and then he charges her on these fake, stories of treason and beheads her like 2 years later. So all of that drama was for nothing. And then he finds Jane Seymour, who's this pleasant, quiet, much different wife from Anne Boleyn, who was all this drama. And she shortly gives birth to his much desired son, the Prince Edward, and then dies like a week later from, the result of the childbirth. So then he moves on to Anne of Cleves, who was a more political choice because she was from Germany. And it was kind of at the suggestion of Thomas Cromwell, one of his advisors, that he finds a foreign princess. And then she comes in. They have a language barrier. Henry thinks she smells and just doesn't find her attractive. So they never consummate the marriage. And that makes that divorce really easy and a lot less drama,
He didn't have to kill her.
No, he didn't have to kill her. And she actually probably made out better than any of the other wives. I would probably want to be Anne of Cleves if I had to choose. Then he moves on to poor baby Catherine Howard. She is like 17, and at this time he's 51. She actually probably does have an affair with a man named Thomas Culpeper. It's a little hard to confirm, but it's most likely that it did happen. So she's unfortunately beheaded for treason. I think by the time she's like 21 years old. And finally, Catherine Parr, who was twice widowed before she married Henry, and was actually in love with a man named Thomas Seymour, who was related to Jane Seymour. And she was about to marry him, but then Henry said, no, you're going to marry me. And she only had to be married to him for a pretty short while before he died. So that's the 6 wives in the most basic summary I could do. Yeah.
I think
there's way more drama.
Yeah, and maybe we have to really drive the point home about this break with Rome, because obviously this is like the thing. This is really the reason why Henry VIII is really, really, really well known. He broke with the Pope. He broke with the Church, and the Church was like a major. Not just, it wasn't really like it is today, where it's just it's a religious thing. It was a country. It was a military power. They were definitely having huge ruling over Europe, the Holy Roman Empire, all this stuff. It was huge. And so to break away with that is basically like saying, we're going to war now. but it's deeper than that because it's a
Exactly.
religious war too.
Yeah, and it caused a lot of turmoil within the country of England himself. And it caused a lot of turmoil for Henry too, because even though he broke from the Catholic Church, even afterwards, he was still personally a Catholic. Like he still believed in Catholicism. So it's just a really complicated matter because he was literally destroying churches afterwards. And actually, that relates to jewelry because he acquired a lot of the gold and jewels from the churches through
Yeah.
through these exploits. And yeah, it's crazy that he still was a Catholic at heart. So it's the whole thing is very complicated. And then the fact that like half of his wives were Protestant and half of them were Catholic was always causing these internal dramas as well between his family. And you'll see that later when we talk a little bit about his kids,
Yeah.
just
And
how
also the
different
fact
they
that
all were.
he did all that stuff to get married to Anne Boleyn, he really
Yeah,
he changed the whole history of Europe just to get married, and
right.
then he killed her a few years later. It's so
Like
crazy.
so shortly afterwards. Yeah, it's like a soap opera. Like I said, it's just
Yeah.
absolutely
And
insane.
it is a soap opera now. It's a great show. So,
Yeah, there's a couple shows about it, but yeah, the Tudors specifically is very racy. So,
yeah.
uh, all right. So then, yeah, skipping over the people who came after Henry, which was his son Edward for a pretty short period of time, and his daughter Mary for also a short period of time. Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, and Edward was really too young to rule, but he was on his way to becoming a really tyrannical Protestant leader if he had had the chance. And then Mary was a devout Catholic. She is Bloody Mary. She is the one who executed at least 300 people for not being Catholic. So no one really knew what to expect when Elizabeth came to the throne because she was a known Protestant. But what they got was a 44-year reign of enlightenment and tolerance. She found that giving people religious freedom or just kind of turning a blind eye to what people believed in worked for her as a ruler and for her nation. She's known as the Virgin Queen because she never married. She kind of married England. And she had this great victory with the Spanish Armada. It's like one of the greatest military victories of all time in English history. And the Renaissance was really able to flourish in England during her rule. This is like the time of Shakespeare and poetry and art and everything that the Renaissance is all about. So her reign was a lot different than her father's, even though she looked to him all the time for what a ruler should be like. And yeah, she was really special. So okay, so now I'm going to send it to you, Justin. We're going to start talking about what was going on in the gem trade at the time.
Okay.
To move on to jewelry.
So let's talk about the trade. We have thank you, Lauren. That's given us a really nice idea of like the political overview of what was going on at the time. So, of course, at some point in that 100 years that we're speaking about, England is breaking up with Rome. England is having religious, problems, or at least drama, and simultaneously, a lot of other stuff is going on. And so, before we can even talk about like the actual state of the gem trade, let's just talk about trade in general, just to get an idea about what was going on. So as we come into the Tudor period, England is very much behind the trading level that was going on in other parts of Europe. So, we have the Venetians who've been trading at this time already for 700 years. And then the Portuguese had started maybe about 50 or 60 years before England did. So when England really started to get the idea that they were going to get into this sort of international trading with boats set up, they already had a lot of competition, and they weren't really at much advantage compared to, for instance, Venice, who was just like a superpower at that time. So it's not really until Elizabeth's reign that any of this big trading stuff starts happening. But so 1555, we got the Muscovy Company. This is the first big London-based trading company. So they basically, their idea is, we want to do trading, but we don't want to go through any of these other people. We want to cut out the middleman. So we're going to go direct to Russia. And they were importing wax and gemstones and all kinds of other stuff. So that was kind of where it started with the Muscovy Company. And then, basically this notion that starts happening with these trading companies also starts to kind of help push this idea of the British Empire. And so we can kind of say that the British Empire begins in 1583 when they founded a colony in what is today North Carolina. So before this time, there wasn't any such thing as the British Empire. Britain was just a country, and it was England and Wales. And it's only really in Elizabeth's time that England really starts to flourish. Before that, they didn't really have the money that they would later come into, because of all this trading and stuff. And then, of course, shortly after that, we've got two more really, really important companies, the Levant Company and the East India Company. And, these are both trading companies that are focused on going east, the Mediterranean, the Far East. So these are the ones that are really going to be able to bring in gemstones. For our specific conversation, they're bringing in a lot of stuff like tea and everything else. But to go to the Mediterranean, to go to the Far East, this is basically circumventing the Venetians, who really had the monopoly on trade from the Silk Road. Basically everything coming along the Silk Road before, let's say, the 1500s was really just coming in through Venice. So this is the period, really because of Elizabeth, actually, that England really starts to become powerful. And it's in this period that we start to see these roots that really develop into something really big, and in this period, but also in later periods. So when these stones were coming into Europe from the east, they would come into a seaport. So whether it was England bringing them in, whether it was Portugal, whether it was Venice, whether it was somebody else from an overland route, either way, rough needs to get cut before it's ready for the gem trade. Like jewelers don't really set rough stones. So it has to go to a cutting center first and foremost. And the cutting centers that were happening in the Tudor period or in the early Renaissance period were, as you can see, a couple in Germany. These were really the oldest ones. The German ones go back all the way until probably the late 1300s. There's not a lot of good documentation, but it seems likely that it was about late 1300s. France comes in next. Portugal was also cutting. London really was one of the last ones to go. To start. Like they didn't really start fasting until really almost the time when Elizabeth is on her way out, to death. So London wasn't really a heavy hitter as far as cutting centers yet, but they did have some cutting going on. And of course, Venice, they kind of kicked it off in the 1420s with faceting. So Venice had already had a long history with cutting and cameos as well. So going deeper into London, so if we want to understand the gem trade in London, we have to speak about Cheapside. We need to speak about the City of London. So the City of London is like the business hub inside of what we now call London. It's the square mile. If you've ever been there, that's how they call it, the square mile. So this is the original fortifications of the town that have now just become basically the business center. And so the city of London was made up of different neighborhoods that were pretty specialized. You have one block that's just a bunch of printers. You have a block where it's ironworkers, Fletchers, and of course, in our case, we have one area of the city that's just jewelers and their associated craftsmen. So Cheapside is the name of the neighborhood where the jewelry district was, and this is where the goldsmiths company was set up. So the goldsmiths company is the one who has the right to do trading on behalf, like legally with the government. So they have a charter to do this work, and nobody can do any goldsmithing or gem cutting business outside of gold, if they're not members of the goldsmiths company. And so a lot of the times people would live in the neighborhood. Like you can see in this picture here, this, I don't know what period this is, but this could be a Tudor era image. And you've got these sort of like shops in the bottom, people living up top. So it's very well could be, you've got, you know, your jewelers and stuff down here, and their apartments are upstairs, and maybe their cousins or another worker or something. So everyone was kind of just in the neighborhood. They didn't really need to go out too much, you know, for business at least. And then, you know, and we can see kind of what they would have looked like. This is a woodcut
Mhm.
from 1474. This is a jeweler. He's weighing, you know, probably weighing his gold or whatever versus
Oh, yeah.
versus a, you know, a, a whatever, a fixed weight that he knows the.
Well, that's how they did it with stones too, like the
Yeah,
carob seeds,
yeah,
right? Like that's
yeah,
what the scales look like. Yeah.
exactly.
So
So
they
they
did
would,
it for gold too
yeah, they would have had
that way.
some fixed weight thing, you know, some kind of bullion or something that
Okay.
they knew the weight of, that was
Right.
agreed upon, or you know, some kind of weights and measurement system that was agreed upon for
Mhm.
trade. And so he's just using a scale to balance. But we can kind of see what he looks like. You know, he's wearing a long robe. He's got his felted hat. every every period has their own style of dress, and you know, every class has their own style of dress too. So merchants would have in this time worn long belted gowns, felted hats, tunics. But of course, you know, as we're going to see, or maybe not, but the fashion styles were changing a lot in Tudor England.
Sounds
um
very hot, like a very warm outfit to wear to
yeah,
be
but you
making
know,
jewelry.
actually, the thing is, at this time, and this is something that I've been reading about more and more, in the Tudor period, and really in the early Renaissance, they call it like the Little Ice Age. I guess it was like
Yes.
a bit like 10 degrees colder at that time. And so
Hmm. I
it
have
kind of
heard
made
about that.
sense. It kind of made sense. But now,
Yeah.
yeah, wearing this stuff, it looks really heavy. Um,
Hmm.
and so, okay, get a little bit more of an idea about Cheapside and what was going on there. So no, you know, this is a neighborhood that has grown up already for 50 or 100, or I mean, well, really a few hundred years by the time that Henry VIII comes in. And it keeps on growing all the way until the 1700s. And so the buildings and the shops along the street, they weren't numbered. So they would have just been identified by these types of signs. So, you know, if you wanted to go to a certain place, you would refer to it by the sign that it was under. And so they would have been these small little, you know, what they called penthouses, no windows, no glass, but these wooden shutters that they would open every morning, and they'd have all the wares in the windows. So you can kind of imagine the streets would have been pretty noisy. You know, you've got metalsmiths and gem cutters doing their work. People are haggling over stuff. Horses are in the streets, you know, creaking signs, just to get some atmosphere. And so here's how it actually looked. This is one image of it at least. So this is a drawing from 1780, but this is the coronation procession of Edward VI. But he's coming through Cheapside neighborhood. You can see St. Paul's Cathedral here, which is one end of Cheapside. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can actually see they're going by all of the jewelry shops, and you can see all these little
Wow.
cups, silverware, goldware, you know, somewhere back in there, there's gemstones. And then everybody's up top, you know, they're probably not working that day. It's a holiday. Everybody's just watching the royalty go by. And
Hmm.
there's actually a lot of different images of this scene. I found another good one that shows even more detail, um, of what the shops were looking like. You know, you can see that they're displaying all this stuff as the procession goes by. And we can kind of imagine that this is for a couple different reasons. You know, like the procession is a bunch of royal people. These are the people with money. So if you're a goldsmith, these are the people that you want to attract. You know, so maybe you can catch their eye while they're going by, and they'll come back later and buy something, which of course they probably did,
Hmm.
because everyone came here for this kind of stuff. And if we want to,
And they were the only ones who could afford it. I mean,
yeah,
hardly anyone could actually buy these,
yeah, exactly.
these goods and objects from
And
them.
so inside the shop, we don't really have any pictures of that, of what the inside looks like, but we can kind of get an idea from this image. So this is from, you know, 100 or so years earlier, maybe 200 years earlier, but I think it's probably still very representative. You can see the way that they're displaying the cups and the silverware and the different knickknacks and stuff. It's sort of the same still. We've still got people in belted gowns. You know, we've got a couple very eccentric animal
It's
draw.
a monkey and
Yeah,
a
I think it's a goat.
dog goat thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's got little horns up here, and there's a dog up here. So I think this one is a goat.
Okay.
And then
Yeah, and
we,
that dog's way cuter at the top there.
yeah, yeah. So he's bringing in the customers. I don't know what I think this is a symbolism, but I'm not sure what it means. Why there would be a goat and a monkey inside of a gem shop or goldsmith shop. But, and yeah, we can see this guy back here. He's about to break up some rough with his pickaxe. So, we can kind of try to get into um, the feeling of what life was like in the gem trade of Tudor England. And so,
Mhm.
coming back to trade, it wasn't all up. This was an up period mostly, but there was a lot of turbulence going on as well. So, as Lauryn was saying, when we start, when we come into the Tudor period, we're coming out of the War of the Roses. And so this is kind of like, it didn't really leave England in a good place economically. But it gave it, I guess, a good place to start because, we could kind of only go up from there. But the War of the Roses already, as a starting place, meant a lot of old jewelry had been melted down and recycled, whether for money or just to make new jewelry. And then later on, when the Reformation comes in, this is another sort of like disturbing economic thing that's happening in the country. But in some ways, well, it's pretty much bad for everyone, but for Henry VIII, it's great because he ends up inheriting, aka stealing, all of the jewelry from all of the monasteries as he's sending people around to kill all the bishops. So when they split from Rome, they said, okay, we're dissolving all the monasteries, we're repossessing all of those, heirloom pieces, with whether it's like jewelry, whether it's what do you call them, monstrances, those like
Yeah, any sort of
relics.
ornate religious object, yeah,
Yeah,
used
yeah,
for
all that sort of
ceremonial
Catholic
purposes.
um ritualistic stuff. And so he ended up getting a lot of that, and a lot of that stuff got melted down too to make more other stuff. So as we go through this whole story, we're going to see this is kind of the one continual theme, is that the jewelry continuously keeps getting melted down and reused, which is why we don't really have a ton of Tudor jewelry today. We do have some pieces, and you guys are going to see some, but that's just one thing to keep in mind. But despite all of that, the court loved jewels. And specifically for Henry and Elizabeth, they both loved jewels. So even if the economy was down, even if, the churches were having a mess of a time and things were crazy, but for the craftsmen and the artists uh, who are kind of trying to escape other stuff that's going on in Europe, like the Protestant Reformation, um, the Tudor period is actually pretty stable for artists and craftsmen. A lot of foreign artists and craftsmen came in to Europe, or sorry, into England at this time because they knew that Henry and Elizabeth were great patrons, and of course, there's a whole court of great patrons, and it was a place where things were actually kind of popping and going on, and so Henry had already made this rule. He had the right of, basically, he had first dibs on everything that was coming in because he wanted all the best stuff. So he was able to get everything first. Everything else goes to everybody else. And it wasn't just the upper class and the royalty and the court. Even the middle class was in. This is sort of like a craze, especially when Elizabeth comes into power. Jewelry in general gets to be very, very popular. And so even with the middle class who couldn't afford, the fine gems that were being, made for the court, they would still use quartz in place of diamonds. They had paste gems, like fake glass gems at that time already. So everybody was into it. And it was
Right.
like a craze. It was a fashion trend. And especially in Elizabeth's period, really any item could become jewelry. Like we have still like records and some even pieces of like jeweled pomanders, jeweled fan handles, even like a
Hmm.
golden toothpick. So it really
Yeah. Books,
anything that
like,
they could
they
imagine.
carried Bibles. Yeah, they would be
Yeah,
elaborately embroidered and
yeah.
encrusted with jewels.
And
Even like the ends of shoelaces and things like that. If they
yeah,
could cover it in gold or decorate it, they would.
they
So
had it. Yeah, they had it going
insane.
on. So
Hmm.
um and really anything that they could imagine. I mean, that you could imagine if you were a jeweler at this time, it's like just be as creative as possible.
All right.
Whatever you can think
Yeah.
of, maybe someone's going to buy it. And yeah, as somebody in the audience just said, very good point. Cromwell also melted a lot of stuff after he came to power, 70 years after Elizabeth. So that was a big thing as well, but we don't get into that here
Such a
so
bummer.
much. But
Yeah.
and one thing I just have to touch on real quick, because even though we're in Tudor time, but we're also in the period of Shakespeare. So I wanted to just have a little quick mention of Shakespeare. We're not really going to talk about Shakespeare too much, but Shakespeare is
Oh,
interesting.
he'll come up a little later too. I mentioned it one more
Okay.
time at least. So
We'll go
yeah.
ahead with it. So Shakespeare mentioned gemstones in several of his plays, specifically by name, and it's interesting because, when we look at this now, as historically speaking, when we look at Shakespeare's plays, we can actually get an understanding about what regular people thought about gems at that time, just by the way that he speaks about them, the kinds of ways that they use the stones in his stories. Sometimes they're actually using them for, magical reasons or medicinal reasons that we're going to talk about in a little bit. And he does it quite regularly. So we pretty much can say for sure Shakespeare, whether he believed in the sort of magical powers of gems, he knew that everyone else did, and he used those in his story plots. And
Yeah.
one little bit of research that I saw there with some numbers, I found out he mentioned pearls 32 times in his plays, 5 times in his poems. And then the second place for most use of gemstone names, the diamond is in 21 of his plays and 1 of his poems. So Shakespeare definitely had an appreciation, culturally at least, for stones, because he was talking about them, in his plays. And weren't you saying before, when we were talking, you were saying one of these quotes might even be talking about Elizabeth?
Yeah. I believe that she is a pearl whose price had launched 1,000 ships.
Okay.
May have been about Elizabeth.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit, just to give us an idea about how the gems are moving around the world. We've got stuff coming in from all over, and England's kind of coming up in a big way. So Lauryn, if we want to talk about trends, we see that gold and jewelry is, or at least gold and gems are coming into the country. What were they doing with them? What are like the trends of the Tudor time?
All right, let's get into it. Okay, so the overall style of Renaissance jewelry was opulent, plentiful, and making it a status symbol. So the more you wore, the better, like you were already saying. And anything that could be decorated was. And the more you had those decorated, the richer you were. So that was always a good thing. It was really elaborate in the actual making of it. It was filled with intricate carvings that were engraved, enameled, and encrusted with jewels. Gems were usually bezel set because that was the most prolific setting style at the time, often with a closed back because that was a little bit easier to do. And like you had mentioned, the less expensive pieces could sometimes be lined with foil backed behind the stone to improve the gem's color. And there were occasionally some claw settings as well. They were kind of like a rudimentary prong setting that would develop later in history. So the jewelry often told stories. It had religious, classical, or mythological themes. Some of them were memento mori, which means remember that we all must die. So it was a death reminder ring to help a wearer live in the moment and appreciate life. And cameos were also really big. So we'll look at some photos now. Queen Mary is probably the most prolific religious wearer since she was a devout Catholic. You can see almost all of her jewelry always had some sort of cross with a big elaborate pendant underneath. And this is an IHS pendant, which is I believe it's like a Greek abbreviation for the word Jesus. So that those initials came up a lot in jewelry. And obviously since there was a ton of religious pieces, that was something you see a lot. Mythological, this one's super incredible. This is a amethyst carving of Medusa. And then here you can see a bigger spread of just kind of strange and fantastical designs that were circulating all throughout Europe. And this is the Canning jewel, which I believe is a mermaid. I think there's a little bit of a story behind it, but I do want to note that I believe some of these gems were added later on. So there's a little bit of question about the authenticity of the piece or when exactly it was made, but it was definitely created originally in the Renaissance time, but some of this bottom part I think was added later.
Yeah, and that's one thing that's always challenging for looking at historical jewels. Like you just don't know unless you can identify the cut or something that didn't exist. It's very hard to see because they're always adding and changing.
Right. Yeah, like we were saying, a lot of it got melted down, a lot of it got broken up, and sometimes, yeah, someone would come into contact with the piece and want to add to it. So it can vary, when exactly it was made. These are some memento mori pieces, and again, you can just see they're usually covered with a skeleton or skull. This one has an inscription that translates to "Know yourself," which was a common thing to write on memento mori pieces. It just kind of goes hand in hand with the theme of appreciating life, living in the moment, and knowing that death could come at any time. So pretty cool. They're just
Do we know like why did this trend get started? I've never actually looked into the origins. Do you have an idea?
Well, I think it's just because there was a really macabre tone to a lot of things in the Renaissance and medieval times because death was so much more. I mean, it's obviously everyone dies, but it was happening a lot more frequently. Children died really easily. There were plagues and religious upheaval, and
So I guess it's just a
the
way.
Renaissance is known for all the
Yeah.
weird
Well, yeah, of course
tortures.
the plague and everything, but I guess it's just a way
Yeah,
of
so
embracing reality.
yeah, exactly. It was a way for them to cope maybe with the scary reality of their lives. And then cameos, of course, were really popular, and you can just see most of them were made. Elizabeth, she really loved putting her image out there, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But this one that I found was really interesting. They're not sure, but it's possible that it's a cameo of Henry VIII's jester. So it's like one of the only portraits out there of a common person. So I don't know if it's been proven. It's just one of the
Interesting
museums
though.
where, hypothesized
I
that.
guess he must have really
So
liked his jester. He must have been really fun.
yeah, which is just like, it just goes to show with Henry, like he was so up and down with people. Like he's so all over the place. The fact that just I'm picturing him just like with this random friendship, with
Yeah.
his court jester that and then he's like off beheading one of his wives, in the same breath. So it's just very
And
strange.
somebody just asked, are these agates? I know the one in the middle is, you can tell because of the
It
way that
is
the color is changing. I think the first one you can
correct.
see as well, that orange on the ruff. They're
Hmm.
using the banding to give it some color. The third one, though, to me, that doesn't look like agate. It might be just from the photo. It looks too white, but
It looks really white and opaque. Yeah.
yeah, it looks like something
I'm not
else.
sure. It could be some sort of shell.
Yeah,
Yeah. I'll try and figure that out.
yeah.
And
But
obviously
yeah,
it's
a lot of
surrounded with
times,
enamel.
yeah, yeah. Cameos were popular really since all the way back to Roman times. So it's like amazing that
Hmm.
they're still, I mean, they never really went out. Like they are still popular here. They're going to keep on being
Hmm.
popular in the 1700s. They're going to come back, in kind of in the 2000s in a different way, but cameos
Yeah.
are like one of the longest running
Yeah.
trends.
Hmm.
So it's interesting.
Yeah. And then with England in particular, ships show up a lot in jewelry because, they're an island, they have a giant navy. And this one here, this is a modern depiction of a rumored trinket that Anne Boleyn gave to Henry VIII when he proposed to her, because their courtship went on for a really long time. And the whole appeal of Anne was that she refused to be his mistress. She would only sleep with him if they were married. So when he proposed, she sent back this boat that has this lone damsel here that's guided at the front of the ship by this diamond. So she said that Henry VIII was this light, this gem that was guiding her and leading the way, and it had this whole, lovely symbolism behind it that was kind of characteristic of their tumultuous relationship.
And that's
Ignore the pave setting on the sails. Obviously, the show didn't really pay attention to the physical construction of the piece,
but the ship, what this is based on, the actual jewel that she made for him, that was how she accepted his marriage proposal, right? That was how she said yes?
Correct. Yeah, that's how she sent it back with a letter, and the letter contained that description, of her being a lone damsel that was being guided by the
So
diamond.
is that how we even
ship.
know about the piece? Is just because of the letter that still exists?
Yeah. There's about 17 letters between the two of them that are housed in the Vatican that gives us a pretty decent insight into their relationship. So, but yeah, unfortunately, like most Tudor jewelry, it was destroyed. Or, knowing Henry, he probably melted it down and gave it in some other form to one of his other wives. And then this is a pendant ship from Queen Elizabeth's time that she gave to her cousin, Henry Carey, because he did a lot for her. He's actually Mary Boleyn's son, who was Anne Boleyn's sister. So there was a little bit of a personal connection there for Elizabeth, because it was a man from a side of the family that she didn't have a lot of connection to. So since her mother died when she was so young. And all right, so getting into rings, they were worn on every finger if possible, even every joint, over and under gloves, and gloves even had a slit sometimes to show off the rings, so he'd expose them. They were often signet style, but they could also have clusters of gems with single stones, or they could be set all over the ring or just in the center. And the signet rings could also have engravings that told a story on either side. So the front might have some sort of symbol, and then there would be an inscription going along the side, or a Bible verse or something like that. And both men and women wore them. So you can see here, these are a lot of cluster style rings and single bezel settings, and great examples of the cutting styles that were used and the stone settings. And this center picture here has a lot of the engravings. You can see down here some skulls. So these were probably memento mori rings. And this
those
ring,
middle ones, those are seals, so you can actually use them with wax.
Correct. Yeah, I did forget to mention that. Thank you. That a lot of the times they were personalized to be able to seal a letter. Same here with this one. You can see it's a Tudor rose ring, which is very popular. And this one here has the symbol going along the side. You can see there's definitely a religious theme going on. And yeah, they told a story just like every other piece of Renaissance jewelry.
And somebody asked, what's the source for these? I know the image on the left. I've seen that one before. That's from...
that one's from it's listed at the end of the presentation. It's, okay. I believe the book is called Renaissance Jewelry by Von Hackenbrock. And same with this image here. And then this one is from a collection from the Victoria and Albert Museum.
Cool.
Yeah. So pendants, chains, and necklaces are usually the focal point for portraits, and they're probably the next biggest piece of jewelry in the Renaissance time. In England, men wore really heavy gold chains. Henry loved them to be, interspersed with giant gemstones. And they almost turned into a giant collar that would be draped over his shoulders because it was so large rather than his neck. That was called a carcanet. And women often wore many layers of more delicate chains, gold chains, and strands of pearls. And they would be connected to a choker around their neck, and then it would connect at various points to the bodices of their dresses. And these chains and strands of gems or pearls would come to a focal point that was a pendant, and the pendant was where the jewelry told a story, again, kind of like the rings, where a religious scene might be engraved into it or carved into it, or it could hold objects, and like an amulet, and they were decorated equally on both sides, and they were just little works of art that the person could have on their person. And another thing that was really popular were initial pendants or monograms. They were very personal and thought to be destroyed after the wearer died. So probably the most famous monogram pendant out there is the Anne Boleyn Bee. This is a posthumous portrait of her by an unknown artist. So this was painted at a later time because no one knows what happened to this necklace here, but it was recorded that she wore it, and it's just very, very famous.
It's kind of become her
I love
symbol
her
at this point now.
Yeah, my married name starts with a B, so it is on my list of things to make for myself. It's a little Anne Boleyn B. Yeah, I just love her little smirk in this portrait. I think it really portrays her personality, or what I imagine her personality was like there. And earrings. So earrings were popular, especially more than when the medieval times that had come just before this, because women had been wearing their hair over their ears, and that kind of went away as elaborate headdresses became the thing. So they were either chandelier or drop earrings. There's not many just like single post earrings like studs that are more common today. And men often wore an earring in one ear. It was a theme that was associated with poets and sailors. I know with sailors, they would choose to wear one to represent that they've sailed around the world. So it was usually a single hoop in one ear.
So I wonder if this is a period where earrings are coming in for the first time. I wonder if this means this is also the period when people are piercing their ears for the first time. It must have been so crazy. Like,
yeah, I know that earrings have come and gone out of fashion, so it's definitely not the first time that people are piercing. Perhaps in England it was, but yeah, I don't know exactly how it started or when, or if there were other ways that the earrings could be attached to the ear, like maybe they weren't piercing, they could have also been clipping them on or affixing them in some other way. But yeah, I found this quote from a document titled Description of England by a clergyman named William Harrison. Some lusty courtiers and gentlemen of courage do wear either rings of gold, stone, or pearls in their ears. So, and here's a portrait, one of the only portraits of William Shakespeare where he's seen wearing an earring.
Well, yeah, I guess it makes sense. He's a poet. It fits.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The sailor one, I was able to find like, a reason, like a representation for the earring, but for poets, I didn't know. I couldn't find anything specific for why they would be the ones wearing an earring too, or what the connection was between earrings and poetry, but obviously there's something there to it. So clothing and jewelry. So there were basically people were sewing gems and pearls directly onto their clothing. Like there was a fusion between like ornamental objects and the actual fabric. In scenes where hat pins, they were really popular for men to wear. I'll show you an example in a minute. And aglets were jeweled hat ornaments. They were more often seen on women's head pieces, but they were just basically like big feathered ornaments that were attached by a jeweled brooch or pin. And then bejeweled headdresses like the French hood, like Anne Boleyn was wearing in the past slide here, and Elizabeth as well. You can see they're lined with pearls, and then by the time we get to Elizabeth, you can see all of these examples here. They're just like encrusted, embroidered. Yeah, they were out of control. And sometimes the gems could even be woven or pinned directly into the hair with ribbons or netting. And like we already mentioned, anything that could be adorned was adorned. So
have you considered to try and put any gems into any of your clothing?
I made a Renaissance fair costume once when I was younger and had more time, and I sewed pearls all over it. But I would love the trend to come back. But
Yeah.
I
I
do make
thought
my
about it.
living.
I thought about
Yeah,
it. It makes cleaning very hard.
it would. Yeah, and it would just make me a nervous wreck. Because my sewing capabilities are amateur at best. So I really
Yeah.
want to make sure that they're secure, and probably want to
Mm.
put my gems in metal most of the time. Maybe sew the metal piece onto
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
clothing and
I
see
know.
how that goes.
I think that makes sense.
So here is Charles Brandon, the first Duke of Suffolk, and Henry VIII's best friend. They were ride or die until the very end. And this is he's got a really great example of a hat pin there. And these are some more. This is also from the first book I mentioned, the Renaissance jewelry book. And like I said, they usually had either religious or mythological carvings that were telling a story or representing something that the wearer wanted to portray. And Charles has even got this big elaborate shoulder collar going on. Wasn't quite as fancy as Henry's, because that wouldn't be okay. But you can see here, he's pretty high up. He's got a pretty elaborate one. And then here's a portrait of Catherine Parr wearing a nice aigrette. And again, she's got the lined headpiece. And here are some zoomed in sketches of bejeweled and feathered pieces. So these are probably closer to Elizabeth's time. They were a little later on. So you can kind of see how it transforms from just like a feather and some pearls to actually jeweled ornaments holding on to the feather.
Okay.
Yeah, and this portrait of Anna Cleves is a really great example of the incorporation of clothing and how the necklace attached at various points. So you can see here the choker collar with the strands coming off, and then the lace and the metalwork and sewn-in ornaments border her whole bodice. So
Yeah.
the jewelry is connecting at various points.
It's pretty elaborate,
And
but even though I know it's going to get more elaborate as time goes on, but even that, if you think about actually just putting on your clothes, you can see why people needed helpers.
right, like whenever I'm watching like a period piece with my husband, he's always like, why does she have like 4 or 5 people like around her at all times? I'm like, that was mostly to help her get dressed. Like it was like a whole thing.
And so somebody just asked an interesting question. I don't know if we know the answer, but I'll pose it to you anyway. Do we know anything about like jewelry aftercare in this time? Because obviously this stuff is pretty hand done, right? Like if it's sewn into clothes, do we have any records of, or have you ever seen anything where they're speaking about keeping stuff clean, keeping it, resewing
So
it, whatever?
yeah, so I know that the way Renaissance clothing worked is that the gowns were almost never washed because they would wear several layers of underclothes that were meant to get dirty and sweat. And, like they were the things that got washed all the time because they were very simple. There was the chemise and the petticoats and things like that. And then the gowns themselves were really only spot treated. They didn't have a way to clean them. So and if they did, it was the job of the ladies in waiting or the servants and maids. So I believe, because they had so many people attending to them and helping them get dressed, they more than likely had someone who would repair or mend clothing. And the jewelry upkeep probably went hand in hand with that. I'm sure if there was like a flaw with the piece itself, they would probably bring it back to the goldsmith or jeweler that made it. But I didn't find any specific, text that indicated,
Techniques.
specific jewelry
Yeah.
care. But yeah, just based on how they treated their clothing, you could probably assume that the jewelry went along with that.
Yeah, it's probably pretty well kept because obviously all these textiles are super expensive.
Yeah, it was the whole thing. So here you can kind of see the culmination of it. Like Henry just wore these like sets of jewelry that went and coordinated with his clothing. And then Elizabeth just takes it to a whole new level by the end of her reign. Like she's really coming into her own here, and just you can see the sleeves are encrusted with pearls and gems and gold thread, and she's got countless layers of pearls connecting to her bodice, and then they're dripping and hanging off the border of her collar here, and they're in the center of the bows and in her hair. It's incredible.
It's everywhere.
So
She's taking it to the
yeah,
furthest level that one can take, putting
yeah,
gems into your clothes in every junction, every place.
yeah. I Justin and I we had talked about this before while we were doing our research, that like if you look at these portraits, you just think that everyone was walking around in these ridiculous outfits, and we really can't stress enough that it was a very few amount of people that actually looked like this. Most of the time, the nobles and the courtiers would wear a couple of rings, and their bodices would be adorned and lined with gems, and there may be some in their hair, but almost no one was on this level of
Yeah. Well, also we have
crazy
to remember,
adornment.
and I think we talk on this later on, but like all
Mhm.
of these paintings are very political. They're symbolic,
Right. Yeah.
they're propaganda, they're,
Yeah. They're not just showing off a jewelry collection, they're
yeah,
making a statement about who these
yeah.
people were and,
It's
how
like
much power they had.
well, I know somebody in the chat had said, like, this is basically like modern day rappers, and it's kind of like the same thing. Like, you see the promo photo for a group and they've got all the jewelry on, but they're not wearing that stuff around the house all day, or
Right.
even just to go
Mhm.
outside. You might have a chain and a ring or whatever, but you're not going to wear, like, Elizabeth is currently wearing what, like 7 huge strands of pearls on top of all the other stuff. Like, that
Mhm.
stuff's heavy. You're not going to wear that all day. It's not comfortable. Maybe to a
Right.
party at most, probably.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so what wasn't in fashion were brooches. They were really big in the medieval times, and you can see some examples of them here. You can see they just look a lot more archaic and not as elaborate as the Renaissance jewelry. And they were just replaced by pendants and the stone adornment. And then bracelets, because they were wearing long sleeves with a really elaborate ruffled or cuffed sleeves that didn't need. There was basically no point in having a bracelet on. So, um, okay. So, Justin, now that we know the general trends of jewelry, I'd like to get into how it was made and how the gems got to the jewelers.
Okay, I can answer that. I know a little bit about that. So, and actually, I'm quite interested in this. My personal project is all about the history of gem cutting, and it's been my big question in recent years is like, how did stuff get made? Um, in these ancient periods of time. And so it's been quite fun to be able to specifically look at Tudor London and try and figure this one out. But so, okay, let's talk about how the jewels. So we already spoke a little bit about how the jewels were just getting around the world and what the trade situation was like during the Tudor period. But we can get a little bit more specific now. We said already that Lisbon was one of the major ports. They're trading with India before England ever had anything to do with international trade as far as a shipping fleet. So even after London has its own ships and its own trading companies, they're still going to be doing business with you know, other merchants, other cities who have stones coming in, because of course they're not going to be able to have the exclusive importation of everything. So from Lisbon, they're still able to get sapphires, rubies, and diamonds, stuff coming from India. The Venetians, even when I think we're still in the period of the Silk Road here, but the Silk Road is going to break down within about 100 years of this point. And at this point, though, we're still getting a lot of stones from the East and the Middle East via Venice, which is via Constantinople and the Silk Road. So rubies and spinels coming in from Burma, lapis and spinel coming from Afghanistan, turquoise coming from Persia, sapphires coming from Sri Lanka. And this isn't an extensive list. This is just to give you guys an idea about, what was going on. But there was also, aside from the sea trade, there was also overland trading routes. And so this one is kind of more local. So when we think about Bohemian garnets, right? We didn't need to go to India to get that stuff. There was already trading routes organized through trading fairs and traveling merchants. So garnets could have come overland from Bohemia, opals could have come from Hungary, pearls coming from Scotland. That one was pretty surprising to me. I didn't really know about that. I know somebody had just asked, and Lauryn, I don't know if you know the answer to this. Somebody had asked, were the pearls that we're seeing in the paintings, were they freshwater or were they saltwater or both?
They were freshwater mostly, and I believe they completely depleted the source for them by the end of the Renaissance. From what I understand, yeah, I don't think saltwater pearls uh, were as widely available at this point.
And we were also saying
Um,
before that even in for Queen Elizabeth, some of the pearls were not pearls; they were just imitation glass. When she's wearing 3,000 pearls, it's likely that a percentage of those are not, like they're not really pearls, right? Like they were also using man-made simulants at that time,
yeah,
just to,
there are definitely some glass pearls found on her dresses because it would have just been impossible to find that many,
yeah.
either freshwater pearls or the pearls that they were importing. Um, I just there just wasn't enough.
Yeah. And then, of course, once trading starts happening with the New World, which is exactly at this time, 1480s into the 1500s, and we've started getting stones from there. So we've got pearls coming from there. Later on, we're going to start having emeralds. I think in the second half of the Tudor period, we start seeing more emeralds in jewelry. And then, of course, all kinds of other stuff. We know South America is very abundant um, in gemstones. So that is just a kind of an overview. One thing I wanted to bring up, because I thought that this was quite interesting, talking about not only intentionally making synthetics like Elizabeth's glass pearls, sometimes these were not uh, intentional. Now this image here, this on the left, this is actually from about 100 years later, but this is already going on. I just don't have a picture for it. But if you look on the painting on the right, this is a painting I saw in London last year. This is from 1617 again, so this is 100 years after what we're talking about. But I just wanted to give you guys a visual reference. These were kind of some stylistic ways that spinels were being used in earrings, right? So we have basically it's a kind of a briolet,
Like a briolet, yeah.
yeah, with a little ring on it tied into an earring. I saw one in the V&A last year that pretty much looks exactly like this. In the Museum
Mhm.
of London, they have this. Now, this is from the Cheapside hoard, so this is most likely from the middle of the 1600s. But this is an imitation spinel. You can see it pretty much does look exactly the same shape-wise. And if you
Mhm.
look at the other, I don't have a picture of the one that's in the V&A, but they have an actual spinel earring. It looks exactly like this. This is not spinel though, and it's also not the original color. It's quench crackled quartz. So they would they would basically put quartz into, or they would heat up the quartz, put it into cold water with dye in it, and it would sort of crackle open. That it would get impregnated with dye. And I know the curator from the Museum of London was saying that they were selling these in the 1600s for like 7,000 pounds each, which you can imagine even today that would be really expensive. That was incredibly expensive, and they were fake. So these were, probably just a few dollars, really, or a few pounds, but dyeing them, making them look like spinel, setting them in the way that spinels were set, as we can see here. Just a
Mhm.
little bit just a little bit interesting. Um, okay, so let's talk about specifically craftsmen and the makers. So how is the making going on at this time? So we know for a fact, as far as gem cutting goes, most of it was going on outside of London when we start the 16th century. As I said before, London kind of came in a little bit later as a gem cutting hub, but there's still definitely a lot of jewelry going on. And so there was a lot of foreign influence in London at this time. As we have mentioned, there was a lot of turmoil and controversy going on in Europe. There's a lot of immigrant jewelers coming into England because they know that there is money to be made, and they're also escaping, persecution for religious reasons. So we see a lot of immigrants coming into London. I don't have the numbers for the jewelers, because when I was doing this research, I was looking at gem cutters, but between 1571 and 1593, this 20-year period, we have records for 138 immigrants coming in from Europe that are in the gem and jewelry trade. 19 of them were gem cutters. So yeah, I guess we can say about 115 of them were jewelers. So quite a few jewelers. And a lot are coming in from Dutch, German, Belgian, a few from France and Spain, less so than others. And then we also have some coming in from Germany. And Germany is also having, a crisis at this time, with Protestantism. So Nuremberg and Augsburg, the two cities that I had already mentioned that were gem cutting hubs, these are also jewelry hubs. And so we've got jewelers and gem cutters coming into England and bringing their styles with them, bringing their tastes, bringing their regional techniques. And, London's becoming, already in the Tudor times, it's like melting pot, which today it still is. And so we got to talk a little bit about how are they actually training people. So we've got immigrant jewelers, we've got British jewelers, we've got everybody kind of all mixed up. They're all in and around Cheapside. Some of them, when they come in, become members of the Goldsmiths Guild, so they're able to properly do business inside of the City of London. Others, they don't want to join, or maybe they don't have the skill set to join or whatever, but they still want to do their business. So they are kind of like doing business in secret outside of, the legal areas that have been mandated for gems. But either way, the apprentice,
How did they get it? Do you know how they got away with that? Or was it just kind of like
I think they
got
just,
discovered?
basically what the Goldsmiths Guild did was they would send around, basically like a, if you just
Or
think
like an
about,
inspector?
yeah, exactly, like a gem inspector, like the what do you call it, the scratch testers and stuff like that, like
Okay.
they were looking to see, were people doing business who were licensed to do business? Were they doing legal business? So, whenever we say stuff is up to scratch, this is directly going back to this guy who would go around and do the scratch test of gold and see,
Wow.
is it, I mean, they weren't saying 18K and 14K and 8K back then. They had the French standard and the English standard and all that stuff. But basically they had to see, was the gold purity up to scratch?
Mhm.
And if it wasn't, you get a fine. If you were abusing your apprentice, you could get a fine. If you were, and there's a lot of actual records. I didn't really get any for this talk, but I've seen a lot of specific records about people getting fined for doing things that they're not supposed to be doing. Like lying about the gold purity, or selling stuff for way too expensive when it's not worth, like basically the same stuff that people get in trouble for now, misleading customers, saying, now it's like, is it heated or is it not heated? That's the
Mhm.
tricky thing that people might do. Or is it oiled or not? But back then it could have been like, is it silver plated? Is it silver plated in gold, or whatever? I don't know. I'm just making stuff up. But there,
Yes. Basically, there's been people making a bad name for us honest jewelers,
yeah,
for all
since
time.
since the beginning, really, since the beginning. So the goldsmith company was in charge of all of the apprenticeships from as far back as when they started, which is the 1320s. So, they're responsible for maintaining all of the goldsmiths, and then the goldsmiths in turn are responsible for training new goldsmiths, so that, there's like a continuity that's happening. Gem cutting was also loosely underneath of the charter of the Goldsmiths Company. They didn't have their own trading company. They didn't have their own charter. So really, for the jewelers, for the gem cutters, they kind of had to work inside of the loosely inside of the eye of the Goldsmiths Company. Though when you look back at the Goldsmiths Company records, you can see that they really don't care about gem cutters at all. They don't hardly mention them. They always sort of talk down about them. You see the same thing in France too. Like, they specifically made laws so that the gem cutters couldn't do business and they had to work underneath of the goldsmiths as a sort of monopoly. Like the goldsmiths want to be the gatekeepers to trade. So we don't know a lot about the apprenticeships at this time. Like I couldn't really tell you how it would go month by month, but we do generally know, because this is pretty much true for through the ages, that apprentices would start around age 14. They were bound for 7 years. And then once they had, and it was a contract. So the apprentice would sign the contract, the master would sign the contract. And so the master was then agreeing to teach them, to give them food, to give them housing, to give them a little bit of money. And then once they finished their apprenticeship, they could, get more money. They could go on and work for the company or do whatever they did. And so this was not just local British jewelers and gem cutters that were doing this. Foreign, when foreigners came in and they went through the system to get legal, and meaning that they joined this goldsmiths company, they were able to train new apprentices as well, just like anybody else. So we can really imagine that when foreign craftsmen started taking on apprentices, because we know even now people don't share for fun, right? Like no one tells their secrets of how they make their stuff or how they cut their stones or whatever. But when you have an apprentice, that's kind of when that wall breaks down, right? And so when a French gem cutter comes into London and starts training somebody, or when a Jewish gem cutter from Lisbon comes in and starts training somebody, you start to mix methods a little bit.
Right.
Maybe before the Jewish cutters from Lisbon came in, they might have been using a totally different technique than what the London cutters were doing, or whatever. Then things start to blend, secrets get shared a little bit, a little bit. And eventually for the young apprentice, 7 years goes by and you get the title of master. You're able to have your own shop or work for another shop. And then as Michael's saying in the chat, if you are good or ambitious, you could also travel around. So you could leave London, you could go to other centers. For sure, I've seen many, many references of jewelers traveling around to different courts. And I know, as we're saying, a lot of immigrants are coming in for this reason, because the court was good at this time. Later on, Rudolph II's court's going to be really good. A lot of jewelers are going to go over there. The French court, all the courts really, they're bouncing around. And I've read several times that Henry was a big fan of German style. So he had a German gem cutter working for him. I don't know about the jewelers, but kind of just like the court painters. You find somebody you like their style, in which case it would have been Dutch, and you hire them on, you give them a contract, you get to keep them for a little while,
Right.
or whatever. So that's a little bit about how they transmitted the knowledge.
Yeah, just before you move on, someone wanted a clarification in the chat about whether or not there were guilds for gem cutters specifically, or did they just join under the umbrella of the goldsmiths guild?
Yeah, that's one thing that's been pretty vague. I know for sure that there was no gem cutting guild in London. I'm not totally sure if they had to, I don't think that they had to formally join the goldsmiths company, but I think that when that guy would come around and make sure everybody was doing legal business, he was also looking into gem cutter shops as well, because Cheapside was kind of a community neighborhood, right? Like it wasn't like there was a grocery store and the gem cutter and then an apartment building. It was all goldsmiths and gem jewelry people. So he pretty much just went around that neighborhood, and he was the custodian of that neighborhood. And so he would have been looking at goldsmiths, silversmiths, diamond cutters, colored stone cutters, and whoever, gem merchants, anybody that was doing business, and making sure that they were, doing what they were supposed to be doing by the letter of the law. So if we want to speak a little bit more specifically about technology for cutting, I can talk about that a little bit. So before we come into the Tudor period, things are very, very simple. The Tudor period is really even the beginnings of the earliest phases of flat faceting. So when we look at before the 1500s, we're not going to see too much. You know, we have this kind of thing where the gem cutter can basically rub a piece of stone against an abrasive plate and make something flat. You know, he could do facets this way, he could do cabs this way, but it's pretty simple. You're not going to get any complicated patterns just rubbing a stone. You know, it's a lot of work. Later on, things get a little bit more advanced. They have a hand crank wheel like this, which is something that we still use today in Thailand. So you could turn the crank and this would speed things up a little bit. Again, you're not going to get a very sophisticated cut this way, and making flat facets is always going to be a little bit rounded, but you're saving some time and you're developing your craft. This is probably not what's going on in London. This is just, I'm just giving you some background. Coming into London, probably it's something more like this. This is the period that we're at when Henry VIII comes into power. So we've got very, very simple hand crank machines. You can see that this guy's German, but we can just assume that when London started cutting faceted stones, this is how they were doing it as well. So they've got a hand cranked wheel, they've got the stone on a dop, and it's just, that's it. There's no angles, there's no anything. It's just a stick that you can hold. And so basically the steadiness of your hand and the precision of your hand movement is what's going to determine how good the stone comes out. And we can pretty much definitely say that this is why all the cuts for pretty much all of this period of time were very, very simple. It would have been way too hard until there's some more advanced technology to do an advanced kind of pattern in the cutting. And I'm talking about colored stones here, not diamonds. Diamonds has a little bit of a different story. And then finally, you know, speaking about just faceting of colored stones, it doesn't really take off until the end of Tudor times. You know, 1599, we see this new machine coming in. This is not in London yet. It starts in Prague. This is really the time, I think this is the last decade of Elizabeth's life. So when we speak about Tudor gem cutting and Tudor jewelry, it was all very, very simple. This is the first picture I've ever found, and I'm pretty sure it's the first one that there is, of a hand crank gem cutting machine in London. And this is already 1688. So we're way into like Baroque art. So really, when we think about Tudor gem cutting, we're imagining something like this, you know, this hand crank table. This is a side view. Crank the wheel over here. It turns the grinding lap over here. You're holding it with a stick. That's pretty much where we're at. And like I said, simple stuff. This is the kind of cuts that we're seeing coming out of this period, you know, 4-sided, 8-sided, not really a lot of faceting patterns until the end of this period. So this is very typical. And of course, cabochons. So we have very, very few examples of what we would call fancy cuts. So here we can see cabochon, same, you know, 4-sided with 4 facets, table cut. This one though, this is really, really cool. And I know Lauryn's going to show a better picture of this later, but this is probably my favorite piece of Tudor jewelry right now. And maybe I'll say more whenever, Lauryn, you show this in a minute. But I got really obsessed with this earlier today, and I went and did a rendering of the jewel. Because this is the only jewel in Tudor times that I've ever seen with this pattern. It's kind of like the ancestor to the princess cut with this sort of, you know, V-shape point. Though normally that would be on the bottom for a princess cut. But I just thought, wow, this is so cool. But we can see, if you look really closely, again, if you're imagining the guy holding a stick on a dop, it's very hard to make perfect facets. And we can see this triangular facet is much fatter than this one. They're not even. So again, it's just going to come down to the steadiness of the hand. We can see on this side, it is more even. It looks pretty uniform, but this side, this part's way fatter than this part. And that's just, you know, it's freehand. So it's just kind of as good as the cutter is.
Yeah, and there is no chance that this stone was set into the pendant later. Like this is definitely, because it just looks so different from every other stone.
It could be. It could be. I wouldn't argue that at all. I hope it's
Okay.
not, because I love finding these weird
Yeah.
things, but it very well could be. I mean, if this was 150 years later, it wouldn't be surprising at all, because that is a cut that we see in the late 1600s and 1700s. But it could also just be one of the first. It's hard to say.
Right. Yeah. Someone was experimenting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's one of the challenges of looking at old jewelry. It's sort of impossible. I mean, I guess if we spoke to the people at the V&A, they might have more insight because they've handled it. They could look and see if it looks like the setting's been opened or not. But I don't
Yeah, I
know.
didn't see
But
any. Usually, they indicate in the description of the piece if there's evidence that the
yeah,
stones were added on or replaced, like the canning jewel when we talked a little earlier.
yeah.
And I didn't see anything that indicated that in their descriptions. So I think they're under the assumption that it's set with the 3 original stones.
Yeah,
So
and also I think, later on you're going to show us the back of this piece. When we see how it's so well worked into the setting, I kind of imagine it was the
right.
original one, but it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be, because it's not that hard to cut a new stone to fit a setting. But
Mhm.
either way, very interesting piece.
Mhm.
I'll just show you guys a few more of cutting styles of this time. These ones are not British, but just to kind of get an idea about some of the styles that they were using for diamonds. So all these dark ones are diamonds. Most of them, again, they're just simple square step cuts, table cuts, cabochons. Even this one looks like it's kind of the rough, I don't know. It doesn't look like they really even cut it. But here we can see,
Like a
yes,
brain. It's
yeah,
such a strange
I don't know,
shape.
keeping it natural. And
Mhm.
then the rose cut really is the only cut that kind of comes in, but this is really, really right at the end. So this is coming out of Antwerp in the really late 1500s. And as far as I know, this is the first one that we have existing, evidence for in English jewelry. So this is the light jewel from 1610. And we can see here, these are some really early rose cuts. They're, by our modern eyes, they don't really even look like rose cuts, but you can see that they come to a point and there is like 8 little facets around here that are around other facets. So this is like an early rose cut. But even, to me, I think it's kind of funny, like rose cuts could even be from the 1550s, not in England, but in Antwerp. But even though the symbol of the Tudor house was the rose, they didn't really use the rose cut. I guess it was too late for them, but it's kind of a
Mhm.
bummer, because it's like perfect cut
Yeah.
for the Tudors, but they didn't really have it. So yeah,
Ships
okay.
in the.
So that just gives us an idea about some of the makers, how they were doing their work. I know that was very faceting centric, but that's kind of my background. So but let's talk a little bit about like designers and makers, and get a little bit more into the jewelry side of things. So what was, if we're talking about makers and we're talking about designers in the Tudor period, is this a different thing, or do they kind of, are they the same?
Yeah, well, let's find out.
And I see all you guys are posting a lot of stuff in the chat. I can't keep an eye on all these things at the same time. So if I miss some questions there, if you guys have actual questions, I think let's put them in the Q&A. Otherwise, we're going to miss them. There's too many things happening at once. And if we miss a question, we'll come back and we'll talk about all the questions before we get done.
Yeah. Okay, so the world of painting, sculpting, and jewelry were all very intertwined. Justin, you already mentioned the goldsmith guild, with their apprenticeships, and often the people who were taking on those apprenticeships were fine jewelers and painters. They learned engraving there and a lot of other fine motor skills that they found improved their craft and just made them better, more well-rounded artists. Part of the whole concept of the Renaissance man was someone who had, a variety of techniques under their belt. So this just all went hand in hand. And since goldsmithing and sculpture had so many shared techniques, it was only natural that a lot of painters were trained in jewelry making specifically. on top of that, a lot of jewelry incorporated painted miniatures or carved cameos. So that artistic skill, again, needed to be present for the goldsmith or gem cutter even to, accomplish those effectively. And then one other thing was that jewelry designers created these catalogs that were given out to the goldsmiths. So not every goldsmith needed to be a fine artist, but there were particular designers that would create catalogs that are kind of similar to the things we see today in the jewelry industry, where there's just like a bunch of pre-made either solitaire or 3-stone mountings that you can just order and pop the stones into. And it was one step back from that, where the designer was just providing the sketch for it, and then the goldsmith would create the piece based off the drawing. So the creative component of coming up with the piece themselves didn't need to happen. So it saved them time, and it was a way to sell to patrons as well. Like the goldsmith could bring out this catalog and show them this pendant that had a religious theme that the wearer wanted to portray, and they would sell it and make it.
So can I ask a question real quick? Because somebody just asked this, and it's kind of an interesting idea, because we're talking about jewelry, we're talking about goldsmiths. How does silversmithing play into this? Because I know this is almost like a different topic in this period of time.
It is, yeah. And honestly, I didn't come across a lot of silver making or silversmithing techniques or information about that in my research, because I was really focused on jewelry, and I think that's more in the world of sculpture.
Yeah, I know I've seen a lot of, I haven't looked at it a lot because it's not something I'm not interested in, but I've seen a lot of books about it when I was doing my research in gem cutting in London. And basically the silversmithing side was more like cups, plates, silverware, almost like utilitarian items, but like fancy, So I think, as far as I know, and I could be wrong about this, but I don't think that there was a lot of overlap between silversmithing and goldsmithing. Like you would apprentice under one or the other, you'd become a specialist in one or the other. If you were a silversmith, I don't think, and I could be wrong about this, but I don't think you were really making jewelry. You were making, of course you could be making silver jewelry, and I can't say one way or the other if there's a big demand at this time for silver jewelry, but from what I've seen, it's mostly about more like plates, cups, silverware, ornamental objects.
There
like
may have been some overlap, because occasionally the silverware, I've seen photo references of them being set with gems or enameled. So I would have to imagine that they shared some techniques with each other, because otherwise the silversmith
I mean, they're in the same world, but I don't think they're in the same shop necessarily.
Correct. That's a good way to put it. So the most famous kind of secret, I don't know if everyone knows, that Hans Holbein the Younger he had this whole career as a jeweler as well as a portrait painter. So I know we said that a lot of goldsmiths would travel around to different courts, but Hans Holbein really made his home at the court of Henry VIII. He stayed there pretty much his whole career and stuck around through all the wives and all the drama, and had a really successful go at it. So he trained first as a goldsmith before he became a painter. Like I said before, he took that classic route of apprenticing, and he eventually compiled this book of designs called the Jewelry Book. I think actually the jewelry book was made after his death. Like someone had taken all the designs that they had found that he had done and put them together in what's now called the Jewelry Book. And that's in the British Museum. And I'll show you some pictures in a second, but they're just these incredible interwoven patterns. A lot of them were monograms and initials that had elegant foliage coming off of them and filigree designs. And they incorporated gems and pearls in the classic Renaissance fashion that Henry loved. And it's really funny how Henry commissioned a lot of these, and Hans Holbein was making them for whatever romance or dalliance Henry VIII had going on at the time. And again, they're these like sweet little designs where his initials are interlocked with the initials of whoever he's currently in love with. And it's just a really funny contrast to his like extreme tyrannical mood swings that he like had Hans Holbein, creating these little love stories in these designs. And some even feature mystery initials, which means that Henry VIII was probably having so many affairs that we don't even have a record of all of them. So it's a really interesting glimpse into the personal life of Henry. And
how cool would it have been to be the guy that has to make all these weird designs for all of Henry VIII's lovers? If that's your job.
And I should, clarify that Hans Holbein, even though he was trained as a goldsmith, he wasn't the one actually making these pieces probably. They were commissioning other goldsmiths to do them. Hans Holbein was focusing on the designs, and he was also a portrait painter. So I doubt
that was his main thing, was portrait painting, right? I mean, that's why he's remembered now.
Yeah, he's more, like I said in the beginning, I don't think a lot of people know that he had this whole other side of jewelry design going on. But you can see here in his drawings that it's very clear that he is trained, because they structurally make sense, and they just portray an understanding of jewelry making. And like the stone settings are all pretty accurate, and the way the metal interlocks and overlaps, it just shows a clear understanding of structure and space. And
have you ever thought about trying to recreate one of these pieces for yourself?
I haven't actually. This presentation was the first time I really sat down and took a look at his
designs.
His designs and his sketches, and they're so intricate. I would love to like sit down and like have the time to do sketches like these. It's just the world of jewelry is so different now, and with being able to computer render things in a CAD program, it's kind of made this type of sketching and drawing obsolete, which is a real shame, because it's just something that this just takes forever. And it's like you have to be in the time of the Renaissance where there's no internet or TV or other distractions to really sit and focus on doing something like that. And if I were to try and imitate him, I would want to put the time and effort in. So I don't know if I ever will, but I can certainly see an inspiration. Yeah. But yeah, maybe if I ever make my bee necklace, I'll jazz it up a little bit and maybe add some of his filigree elements and, some of this interlocking pattern going on. It's stunning. So then in Elizabeth's time, there was a man named Nicholas Hilliard, the limner, and he came from a family of goldsmiths as well. He joined the Freedom of Goldsmiths Hall as an apprentice, and again took the same sort of route that Hans Holbein did, where he apprenticed and then learned his skills. But he was also a gifted painter, and he specialized in lockets with engraved cameos and painted miniatures, which is what a limner does. And he really helped portray Queen Elizabeth as a symbol of national unity by creating these miniature paintings, and elevated that art form into a form of propaganda that was really effective for her role. So he was her jeweler and her personal artist, but he was also like, I wouldn't go so far as to call him a politician, but he was definitely helping to market her and put out a message about her that was what she wanted to say, about herself. She wanted to portray herself as a powerful ruler and put her face out there as the face of the nation. And she could only do that with his help. This is a great example from the Heneage jewel of the painted miniatures. You can see here that it's got incredible detail. Obviously it's been worn away a little bit, but it's just, his skill is insanely good.
Considering how old this is, it's pretty amazing that we can still pretty clearly see what's being depicted.
Right. The detail on the lace,
yeah.
it's just, whew.
last year they had an exhibition at the National Gallery in London. It was an exhibition of Nicholas Hilliard's miniatures, and it was really, really cool. I think this one was in there. I can't remember, but
I would hope so.
they had a ton. I mean, just there were so many. It was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And these were like given out, and not this one specifically, but the miniatures were given out as gifts, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but they wanted these everywhere so that her face was on everyone's mind all the time. So I think now we're going to move into talking about specific pieces, right, Justin?
Yeah,
about
yeah.
You know, like the culture of jewelry in each of the courts of Henry and Elizabeth.
You've kind of showed us some of the really important maker or the designers, right? So then if we can see like maybe some of the more well remembered or important jewels of the time.
Yeah. So just to give a background of there's some differences in the culture of jewelry between Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I. So like he had said before, he got first sight on all the jewels and had more jewels than anyone, and he always had the best, and that includes his wives. So he went so far as to start creating these sets of jewelries called parures, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but they were literally like, you know, they had a collar and matching rings and a matching pendant and a matching hat pin and whatever he wanted to compile together. So he's very coordinated, and there's definitely evidence that he recycled jewelry amongst his wives. So I'll show you a picture of that in a second. But he died with over 3,500 jewels and ornamental objects in his possession. And it's very hard to read here, but this is a little excerpt from the inventory that was compiled after his death, which I believe is a book you can purchase and read. I'm sure they made it, they printed the text so that it's a little easier than the original handwriting.
Yeah.
But you can see here, this is like a pinnacle example of just how he incorporated jewels into his clothing and how he did start creating these sets. Like all of the colors coordinate and match, all of the gemstones coordinate and match, starting with the hat. The pattern on the hat and the collar and on the sleeves is very similar, and he is just living his best life and his opulent fashion there. He just looks so happy in this portrait. Yeah. I think he really loved this outfit.
Somebody asked, did he recycle the jewels of the beheaded wives? I think that's a definitely yes, right?
So yeah, I don't actually have an example of recycled jewelry from Anne Boleyn, but I know for sure, like poor Catherine of Aragon, she just got, I mean, it's all such a sad story, but Catherine of Aragon, I know, like before they were even officially divorced, Henry had handed over all of her jewels to Anne Boleyn. And you can see here, this is a portrait of Jane Seymour, and she's got this monogram pendant here that is definitely something that belonged to Catherine of Aragon. And Jane Seymour actually was a supporter of Catherine of Aragon. She was around when Anne Boleyn was, when all of the drama with Anne Boleyn was going on, and Jane Seymour witnessed that and always was on the side of Catherine of Aragon. So it might have been a calculated choice for her to wear this pendant in this portrait because she wanted to show that she supported Catherine over Anne. And then this pendant here, it's just a 3-stone drop with 2 gems at the top and then a pearl coming down below. And it's shown here in Catherine Howard's portrait and Catherine Parr's portrait. So since Jane Seymour died, I think it was just a matter of like the jewels just got passed down to whoever the next wife was. But yeah, it's just there's definitely some photo evidence that Henry was just passing them along.
Yeah. And
I'm sure like he did have jewelry made for his wives or clothing made for them too when they were in his favor, but it was probably just, there was a limit to how much new jewelry could be created all the time when he was the one who needed the most.
I wonder what their attitude was, especially like Jane Seymour, she's wearing this necklace that she knows belonged to Catherine of Aragon. I wonder if it's sort of bitter, like.
Well, no, that's what I was saying. This one, there's probably evidence that she was happy to wear this one because this was something that, like, she supported Catherine of Aragon. She didn't think that at this time, by the time she got married to Henry VIII, Catherine had passed away, and obviously Anne had gotten beheaded. But like I said, she had witnessed the whole, drama between, Henry leaving, Catherine for Anne, and she never thought that, she didn't agree with that. She supported Catherine of Aragon. So, and they were both Catholics.
Okay.
So it would have been.
Well, that was the commonality there.
Yeah.
Somebody in the chat had mentioned like jeweled, or maybe this is my own idea, but jeweled cod pieces. We never see jeweled cod pieces. We see so many cod pieces in this period, but they're not.
Yeah.
And they're obviously focal points. I mean, for sure, but they're not jeweled. I wonder if that would have been a little bit too much, or some kind of weird, a little bit taboo or something. Like, we're not gonna put a sapphire down there.
I don't know. I mean, Henry VIII was pretty proud of his cod pieces, to be honest. Like, I don't think he had any shame. It may have just been, I don't know, like maybe he just never bothered to commission an encrusted one. But
he missed a trick right there, man.
He was really insecure about his virility, because, his whole life was filled with this struggle to have a male heir and fertility in general. So maybe there was probably a lot of psychological drama going on around that maybe just, I don't know if we'll ever fully understand it, but it's the whole thing.
It's weird because I know we're eventually going to start talking about magical uses of stones. It's weird that I haven't, maybe you've seen this, but I haven't seen any references to him using any stones for, like, trying to have a baby. You know what I mean? Like, trying to impregnate his wife. Like, I haven't seen any magical remedies ever, or, like a gemstone codpiece. It makes so much sense if you're trying to impregnate someone.
Well, I think the whole idea was that it was never his fault.
Oh, yeah.
Always the fault of his wives. So I think looking for a spell or an amulet or anything like that would imply that it was somehow on him, and that was totally against his personality. So I could see that's probably why there's no evidence of that. I think the farthest he went maybe was like asking an astrologer or a fortune teller, if the next wife was the right choice. But again, that was probably the limit to his admission of, fault for not having more heirs. So and Henry was buying jewelry up until the day he died, and a really good example of that is the Three Brethren, also known as the Burgundian crown jewel. And it was originally a shoulder clasp containing 3 ballast rubies, which means they were actually table cut spinels. Pretty much any red stone back then was called a ruby, and it was only later discovered that a lot of them were actually spinels. And it had 4 pearls and a pyramid cut diamond that was believed to be one of the largest in Europe at the time. And it was originally commissioned by John Volovar in France in the early 1400s. And then it ended up in the hands of someone named Jacob Fugger. And he was known to be the richest man of all time. I think in today's money, it's about, his net worth would have been about like $400 billion. So he was loaded. And
even now he was heavy.
But yeah, like beyond just obscene wealth. Like, and he acquired his wealth as a monopolistic mining entrepreneur. He loaned money to nobility and royalty in exchange for more copper and silver mining rights, and just got richer and richer. But sadly, he still died alone after being in a loveless marriage that produced no children. So I guess money doesn't buy everything. And all of his inheritance went to his nephew, including the Three Brethren jewel. And his nephew was brokering a deal that took 2 years to go through to sell this pendant to Henry VIII. So by the time the sale was over, Henry was dead, and his children all possessed it. So there's actually obviously there's no portraits of Henry wearing it, even though he clearly wanted to. But in the Ermine portrait, you can see a close-up where Elizabeth is depicting herself with it. So more than likely she had it and enjoyed it. And eventually this jewel was passed down through the next royal family, the Stuarts. But then I believe, I don't know exactly where it ended up. It kind of disappears. And then I do think it was broken up eventually, and it's no longer one whole piece. So.
And maybe you just sort of mentioned this, but maybe we should emphasize it a little bit, something that we didn't put into the talk at all. But like, from what I've read so far, goldsmiths were very much like the banks of Tudor. I mean, not just in England, of all of Europe. Like, banks financed a lot of wars. Banks financed a lot of political projects. Henry VIII was, sorry, not banks, goldsmiths. Henry VIII was regularly borrowing money from goldsmiths because goldsmiths have capital, right? Like the Fuggers in Germany, but you know, the guys in Hatton Garden as well. Sorry, Cheapside. A lot of those goldsmiths end up becoming super, super rich, and I don't think we really will even get into that. But like, they're doing so much money movement with gold, with gems, you know, buying, selling, borrowing, loaning, whatever. You know, getting favors with the king because they're giving him gold so that he can go and do his small war or whatever. So kind of an interesting thing that it doesn't really exist in that way today, because we have, you know, these new things called banks.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like the closest equivalent is like a pawn shop or something, but it's not on a political or national or international level of economic entanglement. But yeah, it's too much to get into. But yeah, the Fuggers were like gangsters. They were running Europe more so than the royal families to some extent because of all the wealth they had and how entangled they were with all the different governments. So it's really insane. So the culture of jewelry in Elizabeth's court was a little different. She loved jewels as much as her father and inherited the family collection. But she had these like holidays, like Christmas and New Year's were a time when she would give jewels away to her suitors and courtiers, and she would receive them as well. So she got a lot of her jewels from, you know, as gifts from faithful supporters, and it was just this kind of like sweet time. And it's just definitely something that Henry wouldn't have really done. I mean, I guess there was that one cameo we saw where he had it made of his jester, but I don't know if that was given to his jester or if he was just like, hey, I like you, and now I have a cameo of you.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a friendlier culture there with Elizabeth. And when she had jewelry designed for herself, it wasn't just like an elaborate fancy piece like with Henry. She was making something emblematic, and she was wanting to portray a symbolic message. You know, whether it be like during a time of turmoil, like she was always trying to portray herself as the face of the nation and this unifying force. And it's something I mentioned earlier with the painted miniatures. Like this jewelry was always propaganda to elevate her status and her reputation. She did sell and barter her jewels to pay for wars. Most often, she would just sell her heavy gold chains that didn't have a lot of ornamentation on them because they were just basically the gold value. And sometimes the next thing to go would be emblems that had a message that she no longer cared about, or an outdated, you know, symbol that was representing her. So it shows that like the message that she was trying to tell to everyone was transient and changed as her rule changed, and her style of reigning over the country needed to evolve for whatever was going on at the time.
It's kind of interesting, right? Like if we think about this idea of like, you know, using jewelry and art and symbolism in this way as a sort of propaganda tool, but it's so interesting because it's not that different than it is today. But because their method of communication was so different, you know, it's, you know, you have to just make a big painting or whatever, this big symbol, because you know, you don't have like a radio or a TV or whatever. You have it in other ways. But like in so many ways, I feel like the Tudor period is so similar to the way we are now, just some essential details different, but it's very interesting to see
Yeah.
how they're already thinking about they weren't calling it psychology, but she was obviously using psychological methods to try and manipulate people to think about her in a certain way, in the
Mhm.
same way that everyone still does today, as far as rulers and stuff go.
Yeah, and it was done with the physical jewelry itself that was made, like the little medallions and lockets that she would make in bulk to, give out to the nobility, but then also in the portraits and like what jewelry was painted into each portrait as well. So there was like these multi levels of uh, you know, messages that were being sent out. And yeah, like you and I had kind of discussed this while we were doing our research, but you have to wonder like if she had a whole marketing team or if she was the brains behind this whole operation, or who came up with this concept, because it really like she refined it and perfected it more than most rulers. And yeah, it's just really interesting, how it all worked to her advantage so well. And at the time of her death, she was wearing the checkers ring, which contained a portrait of her and most likely her mother. There's a little bit of debate about that between rubies, diamonds, and pearls. So real quick before I get into that ring, this is the Heneage jewel, and it's a perfect example of the propaganda jewelry that was sent out. This one was made specifically for what was his name? Sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the person that it was made specifically for, but it's got her profile in the front and the painted miniature that we already took a look at when it opens up, the Tudor rose symbol here to denote her legacy and where she came from, and then this image of a ship on the back, where she is this ship that is in this storm, and she's the captain guiding England through turmoil into a time of peace and stability. So
So it's so rich with symbols. Like it's so on a level that we almost never approach today. Besides the fact that they're using every single side, it
yeah.
opens, got something under the lid on the back, but the level of symbolism here is just it's so
Yeah.
deep. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing to think that a normal, whoever is a normal person in the court of Elizabeth the First would see this and understand all of these different things. I mean, I guess we're a little bit out of touch with the symbolism of Tudor times, but yeah, I guess somebody would just have an understanding of what this meant. All these
Mm-hmm.
different things. It's so cool.
Yeah, and I just glanced at my notes. His name is Thomas Heneage. I knew it was, I knew the last name was Heneage, and I just didn't want to say the wrong first name. But he was a notable courtier who incurred her favor somehow, and it's debated about whether or not he just received the painted miniature or if he got the whole piece. But either way, it was made for him to some extent as a way of saying thank you for his faithful work to the Queen.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a connection to Elizabeth and her mom in some of her jewelry. Like I just said, she died wearing this ring called the checkers ring. It's made of mother of pearl and gold, and it's encrusted with rubies and diamonds. And then it opens up, and there's two portraits. One is clearly Elizabeth, and the only reason people wonder whether or not it's actually Anne Boleyn is because the hair is a little lighter than Anne Boleyn's hair is thought to have been, but it's really hard to guess who else it could possibly be. And there's also this sketch that was found of Anne Boleyn's coronation, where you can see here, it's very rudimentary, but there's a very clear similarity between the crown that she's wearing in this little sketch and the crown that Elizabeth wears when she's coronated. So I always wonder, because Anne Boleyn died when Elizabeth was not even 3 years old, so she never got to know her mom. And afterwards, since her mom was disgraced and beheaded and on these trumped up charges of treason, she obviously probably wasn't told very many positive stories about her mother and had to kind of create her own story about her. And it's just so sad because Elizabeth was this second unwanted princess, and her mom was basically executed because she couldn't produce a male heir. And then it's just funny because Henry dies and his son dies, and there's this daughter, Elizabeth, who goes on to become the greatest ruler England has ever seen, really, and still remains that. And none of them got to see like how all this drama was for nothing because, you know, Elizabeth was born and she went on to be this great ruler. And it's just really sad. You know, I think Anne Boleyn would have been really happy to know what her daughter became. And I do think that Elizabeth like admired her mother and, you know, thought about her when she ruled, because Anne Boleyn was a, you know, very cunning and very strategic. So even though it didn't work out well for her in the end, I think she definitely took inspiration from both her mother and her father. And it's just nice that, yeah, all that we know all of that through jewelry, you know, because there's very little record of Elizabeth ever talking about her mom. She never moved her mother's remains. So I think like a lot of it was a political choice to, you know, not do that because her mom was the source of so much strife for England. That was really like her reputation changed throughout history about whether or not people sympathized with her or hated her. So I think Elizabeth kind of had to stay away and think about that only in personal situations. So it's just really interesting.
Yeah.
So probably the most famous propaganda jewel that Elizabeth had made for her was the Phoenix jewel. It was designed by Nicholas Hilliard in the between 1570 and 1580. It's a gold profile of her. You can see it's just got this gorgeous carved and engraving work in it, and it's surrounded by this exquisitely done glass enamel with the Tudor roses all around her, again harkening back to her legacy in the Tudor dynasty. And on the back is the phoenix, which symbolized a lot of things for her. You know, obviously the phoenix is a symbol of rebirth, and this you know, correlated directly to England. Like Queen Elizabeth was this rebirth of the nation, and she was this new breath of life into the empire or the burgeoning empire that was slowly growing. And it was also associated with chastity, and she was the Virgin Queen. So the phoenix meant a lot to her, and it was exactly the kind of symbol she wanted to represent her. And yeah, above you can see her monogram initial, and the piece is not portrayed on a chain, but the fact that it loops up into this wreath here at the top indicates that it's meant to be worn. So she wanted. It
looks like, you think there's a loop at the bottom too, like they could have connected another chain and done like a series.
Yeah, I was wondering that when I was taking a look at it, because there's really not any other loop like that throughout the piece. So yeah, one would think that it probably was meant to be, you know, incorporated into.
And really another great example of just like using every single, you know, there's no empty side. It's like they even enameled the back. It's so ornately done.
Yeah, she didn't waste any time or opportunity to tell the story. So yeah, she really was the master of marketing herself.
And we were kind of wondering about this before. Like I wonder if she had a whole team of people helping her like figure these symbols out, or if this was like a personal hobby of hers. So like, you know, if she was like masters of symbolism or something, you know what I mean? Like who's thinking about symbols and how to execute them in a propaganda type way?
Yeah, I'm sure she had help, but she was such a strategic ruler. Like, you know, choosing not to marry, choosing to never truly name an heir. These were all like really calculated decisions. She also like very hesitantly went on military exploits. You know, she always thought really hard before any decisions. So I think just with the level of thought she put into everything else, she had to have been pretty involved in the planning of these objects and the message that they were trying to portray. So I'm sure, like I said, it probably wasn't all her, but I think she definitely played a large role in
for sure.
Her image. So yeah, now that we've covered how jewelry could be used as propaganda and how it was used by royalty and nobility to portray whatever sort of message they were trying to put across, why don't we get into some, magical uses and talk about, what gems were used for amulets and other fun occult pieces, Justin.
Okay. This is a little bit of a personal passion of mine, so it was kind of fun to get. I hadn't really ever looked into specifically the Tudor magical beliefs before. I've looked at it a lot in general for the Renaissance because it's just something that I'm into, but it was kind of fun to just get a little bit more into the ritual side of Tudor England. And so just to, I guess, give a first impression, basically, we have to understand that the worldview of the Tudor period was really, really different than it is today. Even inside of Catholicism, which we know is sort of falling out of favor during Tudor times, or was, battling for favor during Tudor times. Even inside of the Catholicism, it was really very different than it is today. They had a lot more sort of what we would think of as sort of weird rituals and rites, stuff that we don't really do as standard practice today. And so one of the things that people thought at this time, or, in terms of like their worldview, they thought that they were surrounded by angels and demons all the time, all day. And so they had to do different things in order to, like, almost like the good angel on the left, the devil on the right, and they're like whispering in your ear. This, I think, I'm just guessing, but I think that idea probably comes even from this early idea of angels and demons being around you all the time. So one of the things that they would do, they had these books of hours, and we can see here, this is Anne Boleyn's Book of Hours right here. But so the idea of the Book of Hours was it had a prayer for every hour of the day, or probably many prayers, because this looks like a pretty big book. But basically the thought was you could read a prayer at every hour, and that would like almost form like a protection. You're like saying a prayer, saying the name of God, or saying some protection type thing, keeping the demons away. So this is kind of just one really broad example of the sort of superstitious time that we're in. So, we have a lot of mixture between, what we would now see as Catholic rites, mixed with folk magical elements that were kind of still left over from medieval times. I guess there was always folk magic. There was always some magical current going on in England that was, kind of alongside the more formal religion. And then once the Renaissance really kicks in, and this is really, I guess, more in the second half of the Tudor period and later, when the Renaissance influence starts coming through Europe and eventually gets into England, we're starting to see even more mixture of like Egyptian and Greek paganism, pagan ideas, mixing in with all of the other stuff that was already going on. And so astrology was a really popular thing at this time, it's in terms of magical beliefs. And so basically, we have some pretty well-known astrologers, and it's kind of known not just in England, but in all of Europe, that there were tons of astrologers. There was tons of self-proclaiming, magical practitioners. And I think for England at this time, the most important guy is going to be John Dee. So here, this is just a clip from the movie Elizabeth, but I love this scene because it's like the only time where we have like a really nice budget movie showing Elizabeth consulting with her astrologer, who is Dr. John Dee. He's like a mathematician, Renaissance man. He was the one that invented the 007 title, and just like really wild guy. The deeper you go into the story of John Dee, it just keeps getting weirder and weirder. But basically, for our story, he was the astrologer of Queen Elizabeth. So he would have been the one helping her make some of these strategic decisions, because he's looking at her horoscope, he's looking at her birth chart, he's trying to figure out, he's telling her the future basically, or his interpretation of the future based on, we saw him looking at these planetary charts. And so here we can see this is one that's directly out of his journal. This is one of his birth charts. And then here we can see this is Queen Elizabeth's nativity chart. So it was pretty common at this time, even though that there was a bit of a taboo around, generally around magical stuff. It was also
because it's like, it seems like religion and mysticism are really intertwining here.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like a love-hate thing. I think maybe from Catholicism it's like a hate thing, but there's it's just sort of like it's just life, it's just part of the culture. It's like maybe it's against the rules, maybe it's a little bit of a taboo, but there's still a belief that it works, and it's still a belief that it matters. And we know for sure that for Elizabeth it did matter, because there's several periods in her reign where she specifically puts a date for, like, her coronation, for example. She picks a date that means something specific in relation to her own astrology, or to whatever the astrologer says is going on in the stars. But basically the way that this relates back into gemstones, and this is especially the case when the Greek and Egyptian influence comes in via Italy and the Renaissance that's coming through. The heavenly bodies that they're looking at for the astrology chart also have a stone that represents them. Almost today we because we have birthstones now, right? This is like part of our pop culture. Everybody knows their birthstone and their birth sign. And it was sort of the same idea, like different stones were related to different planets had different influences. And if you wanted to, for instance, bring in more influence of a certain planet, you could wear a stone that represented that planet to try and get some of that influence. I got a couple interesting quotes from the time. There's a book from 1584 called The Discovery of Witchcraft by Reginald Scott. And in the book, he says, stones receive their virtues altogether of the planets and heavenly bodies, and have not only the operation of the planets, but sometimes the very images and impressions of the stars naturally engraved in them. So basically they're seeing these influences from the planets emanating from the stones. And so when they wear those stones, that they can kind of get the power or get the influence or whatever of that planet. So even though the stones, held celestial influences, the magic wasn't just coming from the stones alone. They really thought of the stones as an instrument of God, right? Like they came out of the ground, like an herb, or like a piece of wood or something. It was part of nature. It wasn't like some other force. It was part of God's rule, but it was just kind of like, this is the power that we can get. Another thing that same book, Discovery of Witchcraft, tells us, they said sometimes a sign or image called a sigil was often inscribed in the back of jewels as an added defense against evil, since stones, through their operation of the planets, may gather greater forces of their working. So basically, not only could you use the stones, you could use symbols and sigils and signs to make the stones more powerful. So there's definitely a pretty consistent evidence of use of gemstones as a magical power item in this time, which is kind of cool. But on the flip side of that, of course, when you take it too far, and as far as they're concerned, it turns dark. And so pretty much anytime they see someone using magic that they didn't like or whatever, then suddenly that person can be labeled as a witch. They passed the law in 1542 that punished witchcraft. So basically, if you were John Dee and you're working for Queen Elizabeth, it's cool. But if you're somebody else who they don't like, suddenly you're a witch. And actually, John Dee did get persecuted several times at different times. And he fled England even at one point, not because of that, but just, his life wasn't all that easy either. And he didn't really have a nice situation when he died. But, even the highest up can get in trouble with
Yeah.
magic, because you're kind of going against the face of the church at the same time. So
Right. And this disproportionately affected women
yeah,
because anytime they were able to make a living on their own, like say if they were like a widow or something like that, and they just seemed a little too suspicious, the first thing that they would always get accused of is witchcraft. It was basically a catch-all accusation for anyone who's going against the grain of society or making society uncomfortable.
yeah.
Um,
And
yeah,
it's
obviously.
pretty wild, because that was pretty, I mean, that was obviously happening during Tudor times, but it just kept on happening. I mean, even into the American colonies, um, 1700s, early 1800s. I think I did read, I forget where I read this is some other time, but I think the last time someone was executed for witchcraft was in like the early 1800s. So it really wasn't,
Yeah.
it's not like that old, I mean, it's old, but
Oh.
it's kept on going, and it's kind of messed up. But
Mhm.
the other way that gemstones were commonly used in a sort of magical sphere was as medicine. And so this is common in all of Renaissance Europe, but Tudors as well held this belief that, different stones had different virtues, and a lot of them, they would do different things. Like, for instance, improving the eyes, helping the mind, driving away sadness. But a lot of stuff, they were really concerned with poison. And so one thing that I found, they said a ruby can be used in a drink to prevent poisoning. Emeralds, if you want to use them as protection from poison, you only need 6 grains of powder. So, I guess that's pretty good. You don't need too much emerald. It's not going to be too expensive, considering comparatively, I guess. Diamond as well was a poison detector. So we can think they're really concerned with poison. And another thing that I just read today was, they're considering poison from kind of all angles. So it could be from the bite of an animal, from ingesting bad food, or of course through the evil workings of a witch. So they might be looking for protection from poisoning from all of these ways, natural and from man's own hand. And some of the ways that they knew about these different remedies was from these old books called lapidaries. So this goes way back, like this goes all the way back to ancient Greece. But we have this sort of tradition of lapidaries. It kind of gets lost in the Middle Ages, when Christianity really takes over Europe. We don't have such a direct tradition of lapidaries, but they were going on in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, and there were still a few coming through kind of medieval England and medieval Europe. And then when the Renaissance kicks in and they suddenly discover all of these old books that had been preserved in the East, the Near East, it gets really, really popular again. And we see this resurgence in the Renaissance of lapidary books. But basically what these books were almost like an encyclopedia or like a medical textbook of different remedies based on stones, also based on herbs, and based on natural materials like animal parts, unicorn horns and bezoars, and there's a few other things that they commonly use from animals that were considered also to be magic. And so one of the interesting ones that I came across today, in one of these lapidaries, they're describing the heliotrope or bloodstone, and they said, this is a precious stone. It's green with red drops and veins of the color blood. The author is claiming that the stone discovers the soil of enchantments of witches. So again, here we can see the continued fear of witchcraft. Witches can use stones to heal you. They can use stones to curse you. And then if you're trying to avoid it, you can use stones to avoid the witch. So to me, the question is like, if you're using magic to deflect a witchcraft, are you a witch too? Or you're just I don't
Yeah,
know. Who knows?
it's
I
a
guess it
pretty
depends on if
blurred
you're
line.
friends,
Yeah,
who you're friends with.
yeah,
But
it's a
so
very convenient term.
yeah, it's a little bit troubling. But so one of the really common things that I've seen all over Europe as I've been doing research is about bezoars, and I've kind of developed a little bit of an obsession with bezoars because I keep finding them everywhere. Um, Rudolph II had a ton of these. And he's sort of just at the end of Queen Elizabeth's period. But I was really kind of pleased to discover that Queen Elizabeth had a bezoar as well. So the idea behind the bezoar, here we can see it here. It's kind of like the same thing as a gallbladder stone or a kidney stone for humans. You know, it's like this sort of
Yeah.
calcification that the body builds up. And
Mhm.
so they would find them in animals, and they thought that they were a cure against poison. And so pretty much every, I think I'm just making an assumption here, but I've seen it so many times that I think it's right. Pretty much every king or queen or royalty had a bezoar. They were using them for sure. Queen Elizabeth had one. This isn't hers, I don't think, but the description of hers matched this one exactly. So I found this perfect picture. But basically, I found one description. It said Queen Elizabeth had a bezoar. It was set on a gold setting with a bracelet, so she could basically dip it into her drink, or she could kind of like grind a little bit of it off and put it into the drink. And they thought that that would neutralize poison. But here's the
Mhm.
craziest thing. I just found this out today as I was finishing up this slide. It turns out that bezoars really work. Um, here's what I found. Modern examinations of the properties of bezoars by the Scripps Institute of Oceanography have shown that when you put a bezoar into arsenic laced solution, it actually neutralizes the arsenic in a couple of different ways, which I'm not going to go into. But it was true. Actually, it wasn't a magical remedy. It was a real remedy. I don't think it
It's
works for everything.
science.
It didn't work against witches, probably, but it did work against arsenic. So if someone was actually trying to poison you with arsenic and you dipped or scraped off a bit of your bezoar into that thing, it actually did neutralize the poisons. I just found that out this morning, so that's really cool. Um, and so maybe some of you guys have heard of bezoars before, and I know somebody's talking about toadstones too. I didn't mention that one, but that was another important um, magical remedy that it was again a natural material. They thought it was from the back of the toad. It's like this dome shaped natural, it's a fossil actually, it's a fish tooth, but they would put them into rings, and they also thought that was a poison neutralization thing. But bezoars have pretty much mostly been forgotten now, but if you are a Harry Potter fan, you might have heard of them before, because bezoars did make one brief cameo in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince when Ron gets poisoned and Harry has this quick thought to pull the bezoar out of the drawer. He puts the bezoar in Ron's mouth and it neutralizes the poison that he was, that he was getting poisoned by. So I always like to think that Harry Potter is kind of keeping us in touch with some of these old medieval magical ideas. So that,
Yeah, I
yeah,
had never heard of a bezoar before.
yeah,
Reading that scene in Harry Potter, so it's
yeah. So
definitely the
maybe,
only reason
so
why it's on
yeah.
my radar.
Harry Potter is a nice entry point into medieval thought. So
Mhm.
that's a little bit about magical uses of gems. But Lauren, what about, were they also using metals and stones in some kind of magical way? Or is it
Yes,
just
they
gems?
were. Oh, of course, it wasn't just gems.
Magic was everywhere at that time. So anyway,
Yes.
almost in the same way that they would bling out every possible thing, anything can be used for magic as well. So let's see, what were they were doing, magically speaking?
Oh, hold on. Things being weird. Sorry, it's not letting me pull up my presentation anymore.
Uh-oh. Just gonna have to start drawing us pictures then.
No. Hold on, I think I just didn't leave it open. Let's see here now. There we go. Okay. So yes, Justin, you are actually integral in helping me find these examples because, like you said, you've been doing this research for a while, and a lot of these magical rings were actually found more in medieval times rather than Renaissance times. But we'll show some later examples that this thought process definitely carried on into jewelry, even if there aren't quite as many examples. So this is a 14th century period amulet ring, where you can see it's a pyramid cut stone there in the center. a 14th century sapphire amulet ring, and a 14th century ruby amulet ring that all, like you said, these stones all were said to have certain properties, which is why they were set into the jewelry. And then a lot of these pieces also have little inscriptions on them that all,
And I know
help.
a lot of them, they're engraved on the inside, they're engraved on the outside.
Yeah.
Some of them, the magic is merely, it's not anything more than just a Catholic prayer, or even,
Yeah, it's so crazy.
yeah,
Like,
but even for them, that could have been an invocation of protection or of a saint or whatever. I mean, to
and
me,
even they were called like posy rings, which were just little bands that had an inscription that was just something relating to love. Like even that is just basically a little love spell that you could wear.
yeah,
And it was all, like as simple as they were invoking some sort of power or, spirituality with a
yeah.
spell.
And so that bottom one in the middle, that's the toadstone. So
That's
that's a fossilized fish tooth, but they thought
Yeah.
it was actually the thing on the back of the fish's head that's like a little scale or whatever. And yeah, they
Right.
dip that in and neutralize poison that way.
Yep. And you can see here in this last one, there's a pentagon carved into the front of it. So obviously there's a lot of
Pentagram.
a pentagram, sorry. I have to fix that typo on my presentation, but yeah, pentagram inscribed into the ring there, which obviously it's a very magical symbol. So, and then there's also this collection of magic rings, or at least some of them are magic rings from Edmund Waterton. And one of them bears this inscription here, which is translated to mean God is holy and immortal. And that's found in books of magic, suggesting that there's amuletic power in this ring. And again, it's that intertwining of religion and magic, really blurring the lines between whether a prayer is a spell or incantation versus just being a prayer. So it's really interesting.
I think if you really think about before the Protestant Reformation and everything is in Latin and you don't speak Latin, it's like, what's the difference between saying a magic spell or saying a Bible verse in a, you know what I mean? It's like Harry Potter. All those stuff in Harry Potter is just words in Latin. To us, it sounds like magical spell because we don't speak Latin. So if if the Bible's in Latin, then one sentence could be magical summoning or whatever.
Yeah, so it's really cool. And so moving on to this 3-stone pendant, which was definitely made during Tudor times. It was probably between 1540 and 1560 that it was constructed by an unknown maker. This is one of the only examples of a piece of jewelry with an open back setting, and that was done on purpose to imbue the wearer with the magical properties of the gems. And aside from it being a very beautiful piece of jewelry and just very well constructed, like Justin had already said, the stone itself is of a higher faceting quality than what we're used to seeing at this time. It's got this little inscription on the back that is supposed to be a phrase that helps ward off epilepsy. And it's, again, invoking the Holy Spirit as well. So that really brings the whole piece together.
Yeah, and that's pretty much exactly what that guy was saying in his book that I was saying a couple slides back. Combining the sigil with the gemstone makes it more powerful. That is exactly what this piece is. It's crazy to me because I've had the picture of this piece for like 5 years, and I never saw the back until yesterday. Until you, Lauren, you showed me this yesterday, and it just blew my mind because I've been talking about open back settings and the stone touching your skin for like 3 or 4 years, and I never knew that this piece was one of those. And it's so cool that they did that. I mean, it's like it sits on your chest, and the peridot and the garnet are touching you all day. So if you believe that that's giving you some immunity or whatever, then it makes a lot of sense. The sapphire as well, the beads sitting on your chest all day.
Yeah, so it's just really incredible. And something else interesting that we noticed was that it's very similar in style to the pendant that Jane Seymour and, as I showed earlier, 2 other wives definitely had in their possession at one point. So it may very well be one of those like catalog designs where Hans Holbein or someone else in Europe came up with a sketch of a pendant design that people would kind of riff off of and do variations of. So again, it just indicates that it's definitely from this time period, and just goes to show how everything, people were working with each other and inspired by each other. I don't know anything about the back of the pendant and the portrait, but I wonder if that was an open back setting as well, or if it was just this specific one that was made into an amulet.
Now that I know that that one's an amulet, my personal belief in my own mind is that they're all like that now. Like everyone's going around with magical necklaces on.
Yeah, and you can see even in this zoomed in image, that stone looks like it's got that same sort of faceting style that the one in this picture does. So there's too many similarities to ignore.
Okay. Cool.
But I don't know. Yeah, I mean, you'd know more. I just kind of see that triangular shape right there, and I mean,
have to look at it in real life and see it's.
Yeah. Yeah. But and then you actually found this really great excerpt from Cassandra Aubel's writing called "The Cultural Significance of Precious Stones in Early Modern England."
Yeah.
So
that was
according
good.
I'll read it out.
It was like her PhD thesis, and it had a lot of good information that I hadn't ever heard before. That was very specific to England.
Yeah, so we saw an example of the amuletic rings from medieval times, and then that previous three-stone pendant that we just talked about was definitely from Henry VIII's time. But according to the diary of Elizabeth Southwell, a maid of honor to the Queen, meaning Queen Elizabeth, Vice Chamberlain Sir John Stanhope presented Elizabeth with a piece of gold that an old woman in Wales bequeathed her on her deathbed. Stanhope told the Queen how the old woman, by virtue of the same gold ornament, lived to the age of 120 years, and being in that age, having all her body weathered and consumed, and wanting nature to nourish, she died commanding the said piece of gold to be carefully sent to her Majesty, alleging further that, as long as the said old woman wore it upon her body, she could not die. The Queen, upon the confidence she had hereof, took the said gold and wore it about her neck. So there's definitely some magical belief. Elizabeth was probably just like, hey, I'll give it a try. It can't hurt, sort of thing. But it just goes to show that these magical beliefs were being represented in jewelry and being shared through jewelry, as a continuation, and didn't stop in the Renaissance. It didn't stop in medieval times. And obviously, like, people still talk about magic today. So this was going on, throughout all the time. So, and it was just that was a great quote that you found.
Yeah.
Like
now it's kind of like, okay, Queen Elizabeth has an astrologer. She has a visor. She has this magical necklace piece of gold that can keep her alive forever. You kind of got to think a little bit harder now, but I got to personally think harder about Queen Elizabeth. Like, man, she was pretty into some weird stuff, actually. I mean, and maybe a lot of people were. I mean,
but I have to think, like, just because, like, with any ruler who gets this super rare opportunity in life, it's like probably really easy for them to believe in God or magic because their lives were magical. Like, their lives were rare and this, like, incredible opportunity that no one else got. So, like, I don't know why they wouldn't believe in fate or, higher powers because it lucked out. So
that is one pretty important thing to note. It's like the point of view, we have to constantly remember, especially when we're talking about something like magic or religious beliefs of earlier eras. Like, the way that we see the world now is completely different than the way that they did in the Renaissance. Like, they really looked at everything as being directly influenced by God, and like there wasn't so much like cause and effect in a scientific way. Like, we're very scientifically minded people now. We don't think that, like, oh, if I get hurt in some way, that like God's punishing me. I mean, maybe some people
or someone put a spell on you or something like that.
Or if I got sick, it's not because a witch poisoned me. It's because I kept the chicken too long and it got on whatever. You know what I mean? Like we have
Right.
other reasons
There's a
why.
logical explanation for everything.
Yeah. And so we can't really make a lot of assumptions about previous eras because, their worldview was really so different. And I mean, we really have to stress that before the Protestant period, like people didn't know even what their own religion was about because they couldn't read it. You know what I mean? They only had what the priest told them. And the priests were doing a bunch of magic rituals in their own ways. You know what I mean? Like if you look
Yeah.
at Catholicism, it's pretty ritualistic. And if you look at ritual magic, it's kind of based on somewhat a little bit on, the normal European rituals of Catholicism. So yeah, it kind of makes sense. And it's not really, I guess, that weird in that light that people wouldn't that people like Queen Elizabeth would be so involved in such devious practices or whatever. So
Mhm. She had more than one trick up her big puffy pearl encrusted sleeve, for
yeah,
sure.
probably she would take anything she can get to try to be as powerful and as potent as she possibly could.
Yeah. Yep. So I guess we're going to end with how the Tudor period ended and where all the jewels ended up. So when Queen Elizabeth died with no heir, the Stuart dynasty began with King James, and he most likely inherited most of the jewels in her collection. But most Tudor jewelry has not survived, and we know mostly what it looks like through paintings. It was broken down broken up and melted down to be made into new pieces. We saw that with Elizabeth sometimes, like while she was still alive, she was recycling her jewelry. And, that started to happen before Oliver Cromwell came in and basically destroyed everything with his puritanical beliefs. And it's just really, really awful that he did that. I'm still mad about it.
Well, but I mean, if you think about it,
It made sense, like politically, for him to do it,
yeah.
but
like Henry VIII did the same thing with all of
right.
all the Catholic stuff of
Mm-hmm.
England. I mean, there's no monstrances in England museums now because they pretty much just destroyed all that stuff too. So I guess that's just history repeating itself.
Yeah, but I have to assume that there would have been certain jewels that didn't get touched, and we would have had a little bit more than what we do now if it weren't
it
for
is kind of a bummer. And
he
it's
was
kind of weird. You think
other ways too, so let's just be mad at him.
You'd think that there'd be some more idea of sacredness around jewels that belong to royalty, but
Right.
I guess there wasn't.
Yeah, there was a bit of a disconnect for that with me as well when I was researching. I had the same thought that is nothing sacred. But like I said, the checkers ring, for example, somehow that has survived, and that's in a private collection now. It's actually called the checkers ring because it's in the town of Checkers. And obviously Elizabeth held on to this because it had a lot of sentimental value to her. So I don't know how I couldn't find a story about how it made it to modern day. I think because it ended up in private collections throughout history, that it was protected from the political turmoil that affected a lot of the other jewels. But obviously there were some things that they didn't want to part with or destroy. And then there's this other cool story about the Coleridge collar. And that was something I found fairly recently in my research. So this poor guy named Ward Coleridge sold this at Sotheby's to pay off some debts that he had. And he sold it at a much lower price than what it should have gone for if it were a Tudor original, because he was told that it was a 17th century copy. It was something that had been in his family for a while. And then whoever bought it at the Sotheby's auction resold it a couple years later as a Tudor original. So I think it was at a Christie's auction that it resold at. And so it got a much higher price. So Lord Coleridge sued Sotheby's for a ton of money. I think for the difference that he should have gotten from the sale if it had been priced as a Tudor original, and lost the case. So then he had to end up paying even more money. And
that's interesting. I guess who's responsible for historically checking out items in the
Yeah.
collection.
Basically, the moral of the story was he should have gotten more than one opinion about the authenticity of the piece, and no one really knew in the end whether or not it is authentic or not. Some people say it is, some people say it isn't. So it's just kind of still this mystery, and this poor Lord Coleridge guy just made out really bad from the whole thing. So it's just like a weird little, it just kind of goes with like all the Tudor stuff. It's just, they got a lot of bad luck and a lot of drama, no matter what century they're being talked about in. So, yeah, so I think, and we'll let this go for a second. And Justin, I think you had another further reading slide as well, because everyone was really interested. So I don't know, do we let people take a screenshot or something? Should I leave it up for a second?
You want to take a screenshot of that one?
And then this will also be on YouTube.
Yeah, and then we can do we have some questions to go through as well from the Q&A.
Sure. So I'll stop sharing now, and you can put up yours.
Yeah, if you guys want. This is just some of the more interesting resources that we were using, and more, I think, but these are some of the ones that I was using in the last few days, at least, that were pretty helpful. So if you guys are curious to go deeper into the world of Tudor jewelry, there are quite a few books, but these are some useful ones. So take a screenshot or catch it on YouTube, and then, let's check out some of the questions. There were some good ones in there, so I want to go back and see. I'll just go right from the top. So Jeff Thiesfield was asking, other than diamonds, was there a popular faceted colored stone material and color? I would say, we saw a lot. Of course, rubies, sapphires, later on emeralds, the big three, just like today. We saw in some of those other ones, of course, spinel, because they didn't always know that spinel wasn't a ruby. There was, as Lauryn said, there was different kinds of ruby. There was, what we now call spinel, what we now call garnets, what we now call ruby. Those were all being used. We saw that the triple pendant that had the peridot and the garnet in it. I would say garnet's pretty popular. Pearls, of course, though they weren't faceted.
And agate and the cameos were pretty
quartz.
popular.
There was a lot of quartz being used, though we didn't really show much here, but I've seen a fair amount of it.
Like what they were using it if they couldn't afford diamonds, right? Just like now.
Or sometimes, like I saw Henry VIII had a ceremonial sword, and the handle was made of quartz, like carved, and the hilt was also had a quartz ornament on it. So they're really not much different than today. I mean, we have more gemstones. I don't think that we don't really see much tourmalines or certain stones we don't see at all, but many of the stones we have today were still or even back then still very popular. Okay, Juliet asked about the books. We put that up already. So all the good books that we thought about, we put them on that list, and we can show you guys that again later. Okay, this one's, I think, for Lauryn more than me. We mentioned this a little bit between each other, but we didn't put it into the talk. Did the impact of Elizabethan sumptuary laws, where's the rest of the question? Did that regulate the balance of trade by limiting the market of expensive imported gems? I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, that's not something that specifically I did a lot of research about, so I don't want to say the wrong thing here, but the market... Go ahead.
So sorry, go ahead.
I probably was going to say the same thing as you were, but just because the queen was buying all this jewelry, it was improving the trade for goldsmiths and jewelers as a whole. So I would imagine that things were going pretty well, for the trade. And I don't think that I just want to make sure I'm answering this correctly, because it's a long question with a lot of parts, but
well, as far as I know from the sumptuary laws anyway, they were there and no one was really following them. That's my...
because it looks like they're asking two different things here. But as long as you could afford to wear what you were buying and you didn't look better than the queen, you didn't... That was the only real rule. You just couldn't have more than her.
And then as long as you weren't selling something that wasn't what it said it was, you know, for instance, low carat gold or fake spinels or whatever it is. Obviously, that's going to get you in trouble too. Were there taboos in jewelry making and gemstones? Um, hmm, I don't know of any taboos. I'm not sure what
Yeah.
they would mean by taboos, but I can't think of anything that was taboo. I mean, obviously, they're making jewelry about death. They're making jewelry about propaganda. They're making jewelry about pagan imagery from, you know, Renaissance motifs.
Yeah, there were a lot of like just random animal pieces too. Like sometimes they were just imitating nature. So
Yeah,
I guess I didn't really see a lot of naked people, but even in some of the mythological stuff, there were like busts of like topless women, and
yeah. That
so
mermaid, wasn't that mermaid?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah. So
I
I
don't. Yeah,
mean, yeah,
I can't think of any taboos.
no,
Okay, somebody wanted to go back to that. Oh, I know what they're talking about. They're asking about a picture that I showed at the beginning. It's this one. One second, let me share it. Asking about the diamond cut on this. Um, so yeah, actually, you know, we didn't go super deep into analyzing some cuts that are in some of the paintings, but I actually did this in another talk. If you want to go on YouTube, I did a talk about painted jewels that you can see. I didn't talk about this picture specifically. They're asking about this, but I did go through and talk about one that was exactly like this, that Queen Elizabeth's wearing in the Phoenix painting. And she's got a brooch that, it's not flower shaped like this, it's round, but it's the same sort of rosette with the almost exact same fastening pattern. And I actually go through and I made like a rendered model of it. I don't know what it's called. I guess it's just a rosette
yeah,
in diamond. But yeah, I don't really have much to say about that other than it's very interesting. I mean, the way that they do the faceting pattern, sometimes like in this piece, I think, for instance, this is actually 6 different stones. Yeah, 5 different stones. But sometimes I've seen, I think sometimes they can do this as one big stone, but usually they're taking, you know, almost like slivered diamonds or diamonds that have a funny shape and they're kind of tilting them on their side. So they kind of turn into that, you know, if we can imagine the outline of the diamond follows this line and that line. So it's like a triangle and, you know, like another point down here. So it's octahedral, right? We're looking at one weird sided face of an octahedral diamond and then fastening it. So I haven't actually seen any pieces like that. I don't think there's any surviving pieces as far as I know. And I know Eric's in the audience. Maybe if he has some 2 cents on this, maybe he's seen some. But I've seen several of them in Tudor paintings and specifically Queen Elizabeth paintings. She seems to use that a lot. Maybe that was their way of using the rose symbolism in
oh yeah, that's a good point.
as a gem because they weren't doing the rose cut. But I do see a lot of these, what I think are called rosettes. Um, and so, yeah, that's all I can say about that. Okay, and then this is the last question that's up here. Maybe this is the last question of the night if nobody else has any. Okay, Lauryn, clearly the Tudors wanted to show off. I think we can agree about that.
Pretty easy, yeah, statement to make.
Do you have any idea, were the jewels that were from faraway places prized more than local jewels, like for instance, the Scottish freshwater pearls? And would we see some trends depending on when, where the jewels were found elsewhere in the world? Um, I don't think that, I think that they would have been looking at stuff the same way that we did. Quality, color, carat weight, though they wouldn't have called it carat weight. Clarity. They definitely were aware of all these things.
Yeah,
Um,
there could
I,
be some political factors mixed in. I mean, obviously, the goal was to have the best of the best. So if something came from somewhere else and it
yeah,
was the best, we wanted it. With Scotland, since there's so much going on between England and Scotland at the time, the opinion of Scottish pearls could probably have varied depending on the message that Elizabeth specifically was trying to send. But I didn't come across anything specifically in my research, so I don't want to say anything definitive about that. But I could just intuit that maybe you know, with everything going on with Mary Queen of Scots and Elizabeth, maybe Elizabeth doesn't want to be painted with a portrait that has a bunch of Scottish pearls.
Yeah.
You know,
The other thing
but
too, though, at this period of time, there's not a ton of sources, right? Like, it's not like today where we can get rubies from about 7 or 8 or 10 different countries. Like, there's 2 or 1, you know, there's just a few sources. There's 1 or 2 sources of emeralds. There's a few sources of sapphires. There's not that many sources of anything around the world. So basically, and everything's pretty scarce, you know, like you imagine getting on a boat wherever you're coming from in Europe and going to India or going to Persia or going to Afghanistan and getting something and bringing it back. You know, I mean, kind of going into the future, if we look at like the travels of Tavernier, he was gone for years and then come back with a lot of stuff. But, you know, it's like that stuff's pretty rare. It's pretty hard to get. So I don't think that there would have been, you know, an
I don't
extra
think they could turn
special.
their nose up to, yeah, like what, you know, the sources that things were coming from.
Yeah.
So
So cool. Okay. Well, I know. Okay, we had so many commentators in the chat. Thank you guys. I'm gonna copy and read all this stuff later. I could, you know, we couldn't read it while we were talking, but I know that there was a lot of good comments going on and good commentary. And I see that we have several, you know, probably maybe even more experts than us, because as we said,
yeah,
we're not experts. We're
yeah,
just
we're
enthusiasts.
just having fun. So yeah, we
But
really appreciate all the extra information
yeah,
and
yeah. No, I mean,
yeah, glad they could contribute.
yeah. I hope that everyone was having fun. And um, let me just put up if no one has any more questions, I will leave us on the final slide and we can get ready for bed or maybe for lunch if it's
The rest of my day, yeah, I'm
yeah.
hungry. I'm gonna go eat some lunch.
For me, I already finished the day, so now I can relax. But okay. So if you guys are not following Lauryn, you should. She's posting cool stuff. She's making jewelry. She's working for Earth's Treasury. She's posting stuff all the time, really, right? Like stuff you're making, stuff you're working on.
Yeah, yeah, I do the CAD design there, and we have a wonderful bench jeweler named Tessa who actually makes all the stuff. So yeah, we post about it all the time. We're always doing something, and yeah, it's a great company. So if anyone ever needs Montana sapphires, if you're in the industry, reach out.
And if you guys haven't checked out Gemology Worldwide podcast, which Lauryn is 50% of the creative team, or maybe 33% if you're counting your sound man. But
Yeah, my husband, the producer and tech guy, who is the only reason why we can make the podcast at all. So
but if you guys haven't heard Gemology Worldwide podcast, you need to check it out. It's really great. They're interviewing different people every show, you know, super insightful, very fun, easy to listen to. Of course, I hope you're already following me now that we're on week number 10. As I said, this is going to be the last Sunday of the um, IGT Sunday conversations. So keep an eye on the social media. I have a new concept, a new series that's going to come next month. It's not going to be the same format and it's not going to be every week, but I do still have more long distance things planned to keep on connecting with you guys. And in the meantime, you can listen to all the Gemology Worldwide podcasts that you haven't heard yet. Of course, follow us in the school for IGT if you're curious about that. And I have to say thanks to the Society of Antiquaries of London. They gave me a really nice grant last year so I could spend a couple of months in London doing a bunch of the research that went into this talk and into a really huge article on the history of gem cutting that's coming out hopefully later this year. So thanks to them, couldn't have done it without them. And thanks to you guys for being around. We had a really great big group. It was a really nice way to sort of round off the whole experience for me of, you know, doing 10 weeks in a row of this series. If you guys haven't seen some of the other episodes that I showed before, I have a playlist up on YouTube. I linked to it the other day on social media, but I'll do it again this week. All these podcasts are up all these webinars are up on a YouTube playlist, along with all of the ones I did before and all of the ones that I'm doing on Wednesdays with Vincent Pardue. So I think we must be up to like 25 or maybe even 30 webinars now in the last 3 months, which is kind of shocking. But, we couldn't have done it without all of you guys. If no one comes to the webinars, we probably wouldn't have been doing it for this long. So just thank you guys for your constant participation and your questions and, all the messages that you guys are sending me during the week. It's really cool. And I really appreciate the support and the uh, the community that we're able to create here. So yeah, I look forward to working on new stuff, new ideas. But I'm really happy with this group of 10. And yeah, so I don't know if we lost Lauren, but I'm
Oh,
gonna.
I'm still here. Yeah, I thought it was weird. I had my video on without yours, so I didn't want to be hanging out here. But
Oh yeah,
no, I won't leave without saying goodbye.
no, it's okay. So thank you, Lauren. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for putting in so much effort and time into doing this. I know for you and me, we had to spend a couple of weeks building this up.
It was really fun. I had no problem doing it.
No,
Yeah,
I
I
kind
mean,
of want to go
obviously,
deeper now.
yeah, I know. Same. There was like so much that we couldn't put into the presentation that I wish I could have talked about.
Yeah.
So,
So
yeah.
who knows? Maybe
We
someday we
added
can do a
more.
part 2. Maybe we can
Yeah.
do one live. That would be fun to do a 2-person talk live at a
Yeah.
gem show or something. So
If you're out there and you want to book us, just let us know.
yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, thanks, Lauren, and thank you to all of the audience members. And we will catch you sometime, somewhere in the future. So
Yeah. We'll see.
see you later.
Bye.